My family started a group chat to decide how to cut me out of my grandfather's will, and they forgot one small thing. I was still in it. 22 minutes after my grandfather was wheeled into the intensive care unit. 22 minutes. I checked the timestamps later. That's the kind of family I have. My phone buzzed on the hospital vending machine coffee I couldn't afford to drink, and a notification slid down the screen. You were added to Thorn estate planning. I stared at it. I almost laughed. And then the first message appeared, and I stopped almost laughing because it was from my Uncle Arthur, and it said, "All right, the old man won't last the week. Time to make sure everything goes to the right people this time. First priority, the Vance boy gets nothing, and I mean nothing. The Vance boy. That's me, Leo Vance. Because in a family of Harringtons, I am the one who carries his dead father's name, the son of the daughter they disowned, the grandson they tolerated the way you tolerate a stain on an heirloom rug. Can't quite get rid of it, so you arrange the furniture to hide it. And right now, in a group chat they had built specifically to erase me, they were arranging the furniture. And they had forgotten, because they always forgot, that I was a person who owned a phone. The 3 dots appeared under Arthur's message. Someone was typing. I sat down on the cold hospital floor with my back against the vending machine, and I watched the little animated dots pulse, and I felt my whole life narrow down to that pulsing ellipsis, because I understood, in a way I never had before, that I was about to find out exactly what my family said about me when they thought I wasn't listening. The dots resolved. It was my Aunt Beatrice. Finally, someone says it. Honestly, Arthur, I've been waiting 3 years for the family to grow a spine about that boy. Daddy's little charity case. Do we know how much he's expecting? Then Arthur again. Fast, like he'd been waiting his whole life to type it. Doesn't matter what he's expecting. Father made noises last year about leaving him the Vance Street property and a meaningful stake. We kill that. Gavin, you're closest to the lawyers. Can Whitfield be managed? And then my cousin Gavin, the golden boy, the heir apparent, the one who'd worn a $40,000 watch to his own grandfather's ICU admission. Whitfield does whatever pays. Leave him to me. The bigger problem is the old man still conscious and still sentimental. If Leo gets 10 minutes alone at that bedside, he'll cry his way into a codicil. We need to keep him away from the room until it's done. Keep him away from the room. I looked up from the phone. Down the hall, through 2 sets of double doors, my grandfather, the only person in this entire family who had ever looked at me like I was worth looking at, was lying in a bed with tubes in his arms, and my Uncle Arthur was standing outside those doors right now. I could see him, phone in hand, thumbs moving, and he glanced up and saw me sitting on the floor and gave me a small, sad, sympathetic nod. The nod of a grieving nephew comforting a lesser relative. And then he looked back down at his phone and typed, and a half-second later my screen lit up. By the way, the Vance boy is here at the hospital, sitting in the hall looking pathetic as usual. Someone keep an eye on him. I looked back up at Arthur. He was already turning away, sliding his phone into his jacket. The performance of grief settling back over his face like a mask he'd worn so long it had grown roots. And that was the moment. Not the ICU, not the tubes, not even the words, "the Vance boy gets nothing." That was the exact moment something in me went very quiet and very cold and very clear. Because I realized I was being handed something my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to give me, and I'd been too proud to take. An advantage. They thought they were plotting in the dark. They had, out of pure carelessness, out of the same reflexive contempt that had erased me for 29 years, built a glass room and invited me to stand inside it. And they could not see me because they had never once in their lives bothered to look. Every plan they made, I would see coming. Every lie they told, I would have in writing, time-stamped, screenshot, saved to a folder, backed up to a cloud they didn't know existed. They had just handed the family stain a live feed into the center of their conspiracy, and they had done it because they could not conceive of me as a threat. And that, I understood, sitting on that cold floor while my phone buzzed with my own family planning my erasure. That was going to be the most expensive mistake any Thorn had ever made. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand why this is funny and why it isn't. My mother was Clara Thorn, Alistair Thorn's only daughter. and she committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with a scholarship kid named Marcus Vance and marrying him instead of the shipping heir the family had picked out. So they cut her off. No money, no name, no invitations. She and my father built a small good life on 2 teachers' salaries, and they were happy, genuinely happy, right up until the winter their car went off an icy road when I was 11 and both of them were gone in an instant. And I became the problem no one wanted, a Vance with thorn blood, an orphan with the wrong last name, dropped on the doorstep of a family that had spent a decade pretending my mother didn't exist. Everyone expected Alistair to send me to boarding school and forget me, the way he'd forgotten her. Instead, the old man did something no one predicted. He took me in himself, raised me in his own house. And while my aunts and uncles and cousins treated me like a servant who'd been given ideas above his station, my grandfather quietly, patiently, when no one was watching, taught me everything. The business, the numbers, the terrible arithmetic of power, how to read a room, how to read a balance sheet, how to read a person. The rest of them, he told me once, when I was 17 and had just been humiliated at a family dinner for using the wrong fork, are waiting for me to die so they can spin what I built. You're the only one who ever asked me how I built it. He never said it in front of the others. He was too shrewd for that. He knew that the moment the family saw him favoring me, they'd close ranks and destroy me before I was strong enough to survive it. So we kept it quiet. To the world, to the family, I was still the Vance boy, the charity case, the stain. I took a modest job at a modest firm. I married a woman named Sarah, who loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with the Thorn name, and I let them all believe I was exactly the small, forgettable nothing they needed me to be. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the modest firm was a front, and behind it, on my grandfather's quiet encouragement, and with a stake he'd given me off the books years ago, I had spent 7 years building something of my own, patiently, in the dark, until the Vance boy they pitted at Christmas was worth, in his own right, without a penny of the inheritance they were fighting over, considerably more than any of them suspected. Not that it mattered tonight. Tonight, sitting on a hospital floor, none of that mattered. Because tonight, the only thing that mattered was the glass room they'd built me a window into, and the man dying behind 2 sets of double doors, and the cold, clear understanding settling into my bones that I was going to sit in this hall and read every single word my family typed. And I was going to save nothing, and forgive nothing, and forget nothing. And when the will was finally read, I was going to make sure that every person in that chat learned, in the most public and irreversible way possible, exactly what it costs to forget that the person you're erasing is still in the room. My phone buzzed again. Arthur, so we're agreed. Whitfield gets managed. The Vance boy gets frozen out of the room and out of the will, and we keep this chat off the family cloud, so there's no trail. Everybody clear? One by one, they thumbed their little affirmations. Beatrice clear. Gavin clear. Handling Whitfield tomorrow. A cousin named Ethan clear. My Aunt Mina clear, but let's be humane about it. He did lose his parents. Arthur Mina, nobody's being inhumane. He gets to keep his little apartment, and his little job, and his little wife. He just doesn't get a cent of Thorn money, which he was never entitled to in the first place. Now, everyone stay off this chat around him. He's not stupid. Don't let him see your phone. Don't let him see your phone. I read that one twice, and then, alone in that hallway, I did smile. A small, cold thing that felt strange on my face. Because they were so worried about me seeing their phones, it had not occurred to a single one of them. Not the shrewd uncle, not the golden cousin, not the aunt who wanted to be humane about my erasure, that the reason to worry wasn't their phones at all. It was mine. I opened the chat settings. I turned off my read receipts so they'd never know I'd seen a thing. I silenced my notifications so the phone would never buzz and betray me at a dinner table. And then I created a folder, and I named it with the only humor I had left in me that night, inheritance. And I took my first screenshot, Arthur's opening message. The Vance boy gets nothing. Time stamped 11:47 p.m. the night their father was dying. And I saved it, the first grain of what was going to become an avalanche. My name is Leo Vance. My family built a chat to erase me and forgot I was standing inside it. They think they're writing my ending. They're actually writing their confession, one timestamp message at a time, and I am going to read every word. I drove home at 2 o'clock in the morning through empty streets, and I told Sarah everything. Because Sarah is the one person I have never kept anything from, and because a secret like the one now sitting in my phone is too heavy to carry alone. She sat up in bed in the dark while I read her the messages one by one, and I watched her face go from sleepy to stunned to something I'd only seen on her a handful of times in 5 years of marriage. A still, white, focused fury. The fury of a fundamentally kind person confronted with real cruelty. "The Vance boy gets nothing," she repeated when I'd finished. "Your grandfather is dying, and that's the conversation. That's what they're doing tonight." She was quiet for a moment. "Leo, they forgot you're in the chat." "They forgot I'm a person," I said. "The chat's just a symptom. Sarah has never cared about the Thorn money. That's half of why I married her." She looked at a scholarship kid's son with the wrong last name and saw a whole man, not a disappointing branch of a rich family tree. And I braced for her to tell me to walk away, to let them have their poison, to build our own life far from all of it the way my parents had. Instead, she took my hand, and she said the thing that told me I'd married exactly the right person for what was coming. "Then don't warn them," she said quietly. "Don't tell them you can see it. Don't give them the satisfaction of one honest fight where they get to look you in the eye and lie. Let them keep typing. Let them write down every ugly thing they are in their own words, with their own thumbs, where it can't be denied later. And when the moment comes, when it actually matters, when it's in front of the people whose opinion they care about, you show the world what they eye in the dark." She looked at me. I want that on the record before any of the rest of this, because a lot of what comes next is cold, and I did a lot of it. And I want it understood that the one warm, true thing at the center of it was a woman in a dark bedroom telling a scorned man that his patience could finally be a weapon instead of a wound. "There's something you should know," I said. "Something I've never told anyone, because grandfather asked me not to." And I told her the rest, the real firm behind the modest one, the 7 years of quiet building, the stake Alistair had given me off the books when I was 22 with a handshake and a single sentence. "Prove to me you can grow it, and tell no one, and one day, when it matters, you'll understand why." I told her that the Vance boy the family pitted was not in fact poor, that he had built in the dark on his grandfather's quiet faith something that did not need $1 of Thorn money to stand on. Sarah was quiet for a long time. "So you don't even need the inheritance?" She finally said, "No." "Then this was never about the money." "No," I said. "It was never about the money. It's about the fact that the one person in this family who saw me is dying and the rest of them are standing over his body, dividing his things, and planning to erase the daughter he loved all over again by erasing her son. They don't get to do that. Not while I'm standing in the room they forgot I'm in." The next morning the chat woke up before I did. I'd silenced it so it just sat there filling quietly overnight like a well filling with poison. And when I opened it over coffee, there were 40 new messages, and they told me the whole day's plan before the day had started. Gavin had a 9 a.m. with Whitfield, the family lawyer, to explore options for consolidating the estate. Arthur was going to the hospital at 10 o'clock to sit with father, and he added, to make sure the Vance boy doesn't get any private time to work on him. Beatrice was drafting, and I quote, "a gentle letter to father reminding him of the importance of keeping Thorn assets in Thorn hands for him to read in a lucid moment." And Gavin, cocky, thumbs flying, "Relax, everyone. The old man's barely conscious. By the time he's clear-headed enough to change anything, we'll already have the POA and Whitfield in our pocket. Leo doesn't even know the will exists in the form it does. He thinks he's getting Vance Street and a stake. He has no idea the whole thing is still up for grabs. He's going to spend the next week grieving like a good little charity case while we lock it all down." I read that. He's going to spend the next week grieving like a good little charity case. And I finished my coffee, and I drove to the hospital, and I got there at 9 o'clock, an hour before Arthur, because when your enemy tells you exactly when he's arriving, the least you can do is beat him there. And this is the first thing I want you to understand about what the chat really was, beyond the humiliation of it, beyond the ugliness. It was a schedule. It was my family's entire operational calendar delivered to me in advance every single day. They told me when they'd be where, who they were pressuring, what lie they were drafting, what they thought I didn't know. An army that broadcasts its own battle plans to the one man it's marching against has already lost. It just doesn't know it yet. So, I walked past the nurse's station, and I used the one credential the family had never thought to strip from me because they'd never imagined I'd have the nerve to use it. I was on the hospital's admitting paperwork from years of bringing Alistair to appointments, listed as his grandson and emergency contact right there in the system, because for 19 years I was the one who actually took him to his appointments while the rest of them summered in places I couldn't pronounce. And I walked through 2 sets of double doors that Arthur had promised the chat he'd keep me out of, and I sat down beside my grandfather's bed a full hour before anyone came to stop me. He was awake. That was the first surprise. The chat had convinced itself he was barely conscious, a vegetable to be managed, a signature to be harvested. And instead his eyes were open and clear, and they found me the moment I sat down. And the corner of his mouth moved, and in a voice like paper he said, "Leo. Good. I was starting to think they'd actually managed to keep you out." I went very still. "You know," I said, about Arthur's little committee?" The old man's eyes glinted, and for a moment under the tubes and the pallor and the machines, I saw the shark that had built an empire from nothing. "Boy, I have been watching those vultures circle for 30 years. Do you think I didn't know exactly what would happen the moment I got sick? Do you think I built all of this without learning how to see a knife before it's drawn?" His hand, thin and cold, found mine and gripped it with more strength than a dying man should have had. "I don't know how much time I have, so listen to me and don't argue, because we may only get this one clear hour before Arthur comes in here and starts performing his grief at me." He pulled me closer, and he lowered his voice. And what he told me in the next 10 minutes rearranged everything. The will, the Betrayal will, the one Arthur and Gavin and Whitfield knew nothing about. And the reason my grandfather had spent 19 years secretly turning the family Stainto, the only person he trusted. And the single instruction he needed me to carry out. An instruction so audacious that when he finished saying it, I actually laughed out loud in the ICU. And that was the exact moment my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new message and a new notification stacked above it. And when I glanced down at the screen, my blood went cold because the notification said, Sarah Vance was added to Thorne Estate Planning by Gavin Thorne. Sarah called me before I'd even left the hospital parking lot. "Leo, I just got added to a group chat. Your cousin Gavin." He messaged me privately first. She was reading it off her screen, her voice carefully flat. He said, and I'm quoting, "Sarah, can we talk? Just us, family to family. I'm worried about Leo. This inheritance business is going to break his heart, and I don't want to see either of you hurt. There might be a way to make sure you two are taken care of no matter how the will shakes out. Can I add you to a family planning group? We could really use a level head like yours." She paused. "Leo, they're trying to recruit me. They think I'm the soft spot. They think the poor charity case's wife will sell him out for a seat at the table." I sat in my car, and I felt 2 things at once. The first was a flash of pure fury because of course they'd go after Sarah. Of course the vultures who'd erased my mother would try to buy my wife. It was the same move in a new generation. And the second thing, right on the heels of the first, was something I can only describe as a slow, cold delight, because Arthur and Gavin had just made the single stupidest tactical error of the entire war, and they'd made it out of the exact contempt that had blinded them to me. They'd assumed that Sarah, because she was married to a nobody, must be a nobody who could be bought. "Sarah," I said slowly, "how would you feel about being a spy?" I heard her smile down the line. "I thought you'd never ask. Here is what my family did not understand about my wife because they had never once bothered to have a real conversation with her. Sarah teaches 8th grade. She spends every day of her life managing 40 13-year-olds who lie to her, flatter her, and try to manipulate her before lunch. And she does it with a serene, bottomless patience that would make a hostage negotiator weep with envy. Gavin thought he was recruiting a soft spot. He was recruiting a woman who could see through a teenager's excuse from across a gymnasium, dropped into a chat full of adults who lied like sulky children. She was going to eat them alive, and they were going to thank her for it. So, Sarah typed back, warm, hesitant, perfectly pitched, the exact performance of a frightened wife torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Gavin, thank you for thinking of us. Honestly, I've been so scared about what happens to Leo. He puts on a brave face, but he's fragile. You know how he is. I don't want to go behind his back, but if there really is a way to protect our future, I think I owe it to us to at least listen. What did you have in mind? And the chat, which had spent a day discussing how to replace me, lit up with relief and greed, because they believed, their inside woman. Beatrice, oh, thank God, a sensible one. Gavin, Sarah, you're doing the right thing. Here's the situation. Leo thinks he's getting a big inheritance, and he's not. And when he finds out, he's going to spiral. If you help us keep him calm and out of the way while we settle the estate, we'll make sure a generous amount is set aside just for you. A trust in your name. Enough that you never have to worry, whatever happens with Leo. Think of it as a safety net for the smart one in that marriage. Enough that you never have to worry, whatever happens with Leo. I screenshotted it. Of course, I screenshotted it. My cousin offering my wife money to manage me like a symptom, dangling her security against my downfall. It went straight into the inheritance folder, message number 31. And I want you to understand that with every one of these, the folder was getting heavier. And a heavy enough folder, deployed at the right moment, in the right room, stops being a folder and becomes a verdict. From that hour, I had 2 windows into the conspiracy instead of one. My silent, hidden feed, and Sarah's open, trusted, actively consulted seat at the table. And the 2 of us in the evenings, in our small apartment that the family pitted, began to run my own family like a chemistry experiment. Sarah fed them exactly enough true-sounding information to keep their trust, and exactly enough subtle misdirection to keep them slow. When Arthur wanted to know if I suspected anything, Sarah told him I was a mess, barely functional, crying a lot, completely checked out. And the chat relaxed. And a relaxed enemy is a careless one. And careless enemies type things they should not type. Meanwhile, at the hospital and in the boardrooms, the real war moved. And the chat narrated it to me a day in advance. Gavin's play for the lawyer came first. Whitfield, the family's longtime estate attorney, was exactly the kind of man Gavin had described. Expensive, pliable, loyal to whoever seemed likeliest to control the money next. And Gavin went to him with a proposal to draft a new will for Alistair to sign in a lucid moment. One that routed everything through a family trust controlled by Arthur and cut me out entirely. The chat celebrated it as done. Whitfield's on board, Gavin announced. He'll have the new documents drafted by Thursday. All we need is 10 minutes of the old man clear-headed enough to sign, and 2 witnesses who aren't Leo. Then it's over. Legally airtight. Legally airtight. I read that on Tuesday. The signing was planned for Thursday, which gave me 2 days. And a day is a lifetime when your enemy has mailed you his calendar. Here is what Gavin didn't know. I knew Whitfield, too. Everyone in the family thought of Whitfield as the family lawyer, but 19 years of quietly taking my grandfather to his appointments and meetings had taught me something about Marcus Whitfield that the Harringtons had never noticed because they never noticed anything that wasn't about themselves. Whitfield was terrified of exactly one thing, and it wasn't losing the Thorne account. It was his license. Because years ago on a smaller estate, Whitfield had cut a corner that could have ended his career if anyone had ever looked closely. And my grandfather, who kept a file on everyone, who had taught me that the most valuable thing you can own is the truth about the people around you, had that particular corner documented in a folder in a safe that I, and only I, besides him, had the combination to. So, on Wednesday, the day before Gavin's airtight signing, I paid Marcus Whitfield a visit. Not as the Vance boy, as the grandson of Alistair Thorne, holder of his files, executor, though Whitfield didn't know that last part yet, of his real intentions. I sat down across from that expensive, pliable man, and I did not threaten him because my grandfather had taught me that a threat is a favor you give an enemy, a reason to fight back. Instead, I simply laid one thin folder on his desk, and I let him open it. And I watched his face go the color of old paper as he recognized the corner he'd cut a decade ago, documented, dated, and I said very quietly, "Marcus, I'm not here to use this. I'm here to make sure you never make me. Gavin is going to ask you to draft a new will for my grandfather to sign tomorrow. You're going to develop a sudden, sincere, and well-documented ethical concern about the testator's capacity to execute a new instrument under these circumstances. You're going to advise, in writing, that any new will signed by a man in Alistair Thorne's medical condition would be trivially challengeable and could expose the drafting attorney to a malpractice claim and a bar inquiry. And then you're going to go back to being the family's loyal lawyer, and you're going to keep me informed of everything Gavin asks you to do. And in exchange, this folder stays in my safe forever and your license stays on your wall. Do we understand each other?" We understood each other. And on Thursday, when Gavin arrived at the hospital with 2 witnesses and a new will designed to erase me, Marcus Whitfield met him in the hallway, wringing his hands, full of sincere and well-documented ethical concern, and refused to proceed. And the airtight plan died in a corridor, and Gavin stormed out furious. And 40 minutes later, my phone buzzed, and I read in real time my golden cousin melting down in the family chat. Whitfield bailed. Says the old man's too sick to sign anything that'd hold up. Says we could all get sued. Something's wrong. Somebody got to him. I swear to God, if there's a leak in this family, I will find it, and I will end them. If there's a leak in this family, I will find it, and I will end them. I read that message 4 times, and each time I enjoyed it more, because Gavin had just done the thing I needed him to do without my lifting a finger. He had introduced paranoia into a conspiracy, and paranoia in a group of people who fundamentally do not trust each other and are only cooperating out of shared greed is not a crack. It's a solvent. It dissolves everything. Think about the position they were in. They knew now with certainty that someone had warned Whitfield. They knew there was a leak. But the one explanation they could never, ever arrive at, the single possibility their contempt had walled off completely, was the truth. That the person reading their every message was the very man they'd forgotten to remove from the chat. To even suspect me, they'd have had to imagine that the Vance boy was clever enough, connected enough, dangerous enough to have gotten to Whitfield. And to imagine that, they'd have had to see me. And they had spent 19 years perfecting the art of not seeing me. So, they looked everywhere except the one place I was standing. They looked at each other. I helped a little. That's the honest part. I won't pretend I sat back and let paranoia do all the work, because my grandfather didn't raise a man who leaves a weapon on the table. Through Sarah, trusted Sarah, consulted Sarah, inside woman Sarah, I let slip a single well-placed observation, that Aunt Mina had seemed uncomfortable with all of this, and had said something at the hospital about how Alistair always did love Leo. Maybe there's a reason. It was true, technically. Mina was the one who'd typed. Let's be humane about it. And it was enough, because in a chat full of greedy, frightened people hunting a traitor, the first person suspected is always the one who showed a flicker of conscience. Within a day, the chat had quietly split. Arthur and Gavin, tight and vicious, certain the leak was Mina. Mina, wounded and defensive, sensing the cold, starting to wonder if she even wanted to be part of this. Beatrice, playing both sides. Ethan, my cousin, going quiet in a way that made everyone nervous. The conspiracy that had been a single blade pointed at me was now 4 blades pointed at each other. And I hadn't had to do anything but drop one true sentence into the right ear and let their own rot do the rest. And while they turned on each other, I spent my hours where they actually mattered, at my grandfather's bedside, in the clear mornings before the vultures arrived. And it was in one of those mornings that he gave me the whole of the plan, and I understood at last the shape of what we were really doing. There's a will, Alistair told me, his voice paper thin, but his eyes iron. The real one, not the one Whitfield thinks is current, the one I made 3 years ago with a lawyer in another city whose name is not in any file Arthur can reach, and it is locked and witnessed and unbreakable. It leaves you control of everything, Leo. Not Vance Street, not a meaningful stake. Everything. The company, the holdings, the seat at the head of the table. Because you're the only one who ever asked how I built it. And a thing built over a lifetime should go to the one person who understands it isn't a pile of money. It's a living thing that 1,000 employees depend on. and those vultures would strip it to the bone in a decade. I sat very still. Everything. But the old man went on, and now the shark showed its teeth. A will that leaves everything to the family stain read cold to that pack of wolves would be challenged in court for a decade. They'd claim I was senile, coerced, that you manipulated a dying man. They'd tie you up in litigation until the company bled out. So, I built the will with one additional clause. And it is the reason, Leo, that you must not tell a single soul what you know, must not reveal that you can see their little chat, must not show your hand until the moment the will is read. Because the clause says this: any beneficiary or family member who is found to have attempted to fraudulently alter, coerce, or manipulate the disposition of my estate forfeits any and all claim to it in full, permanently. He gripped my hand. Do you understand what I've done, boy? I've built a trap, and I've spent 3 years waiting to see who'd walk into it. And they are walking into it right now, on their own, every single day, in that chat, in their own words, with their own thumbs. Every message they send plotting to cut you out is a message forfeiting their own share. You don't have to defeat them, Leo. You just have to let them keep typing, keep them talking, keep them scheming, keep the evidence coming, and protect me long enough to reach the finish line. And then stand up at the reading and show the room what they wrote. The will disinherits them, but their own words are what pull the trigger. I gave you the gun 19 years ago. They're loading it for you now. I walked out of that ICU into a hospital hallway, and I had to stand still for a full minute with my hand against the wall because the sheer audacity of it, the patience of it, the love of it. My grandfather had spent 3 years in the last of his life building me a fortress out of my family's own worst natures. And all I had to do was survive to the reading and keep the folder growing, which was good because the family was about to get desperate, and desperate people are dangerous even when you can read their plans. Because a plan you can see is still a plan you have to stop. The next play came from Arthur, and it was uglier than anything before, and the chat delivered it to me 2 days early as always. New approach. Arthur typed once the Whitfield disaster had settled and the leak paranoia had cooled to a low simmer. We stop trying to change the will and start trying to change who controls the man. Father can't sign a new will, fine. But if a court declares him mentally incompetent, the will doesn't matter because an incompetent man's estate goes into guardianship, and I'm the eldest, and I become guardian, and a guardian controls everything the moment the gavel falls. I've already spoken to Dr. Ellis. And here my blood went cold because Ellis was one of Alistair's own physicians, who's willing to submit an assessment that father is non-compos mentis, confused, incapable of managing his affairs. We file for emergency guardianship Monday. Once I'm guardian, Leo's little bedside visits stop. The old will is irrelevant, and every asset routes through me. Clean, legal, permanent. And the best part, there's no signature to forge and no lawyer to bribe. Just a doctor's opinion and a judge's gavel. I read it Friday night. The filing was Monday. And for the first time in this whole Cold War, I felt real fear. Because this was the one attack that could actually work. Declare the old man incompetent, seize guardianship, and the real will, the trap, the 3 years of patience. All of it would be locked in a drawer while Arthur stripped the company for as long as Alistair clung to life. A bribed lawyer I could stop with a folder. A bribed doctor and a guardianship petition was a different animal. And it was coming in 72 hours. And the only person who could sign the medical rebuttal that would blow Dr. Ellis's assessment out of the water was a dying man whose clear mornings were getting shorter every day. I looked at the message one more time. And then I did what my grandfather had taught me to do when the enemy finally throws the punch you were dreading. I stopped being afraid and I got precise. Because Arthur had just made his third mistake. He told me the doctor's name. You cannot bribe your way past a diagnosis. You can only out-document it. So I spent my hidden money for the first time in this whole war, the money the family didn't know I had, the fortune the Vance boy wasn't supposed to possess, and I spent it on the 2 things that beat a bought doctor and a rushed petition. A better doctor and a permanent record. On Saturday morning, during one of my grandfather's clear windows, a neurologist flew in from across the country. The kind of specialist whose name on an assessment makes judges sit up straight. A woman with no connection to the Harringtons and no reason to lie. And she spent 2 hours with Alistair. And she administered every cognitive assessment in the book. And she documented in exhaustive and unimpeachable clinical detail that Alistair Thorne, though gravely ill, though failing, though lucid only in windows, was during those windows fully competent, oriented, and capable of understanding and directing his own affairs. And while she worked, I did the other thing, the thing my grandfather asked me to do himself, because he understood records better than anyone alive. We made a video. Alistair, propped up, clear-eyed, stated his name, the date, the names of the president and the hospital, and his own children, answered the neurologist's questions on camera, and then looked directly into the lens and said, in a voice that was thin but absolutely steady, "I am Alistair Thorne. I am of sound mind. I know exactly what my family is attempting to do, and I know exactly why. My estate is disposed of according to a will I executed 3 years ago in full possession of my faculties, and any attempt to declare me incompetent is a fraud designed to circumvent my clearly stated wishes. Let the record show that I anticipated this, and that I was lucid enough to say so." Then he added, with the ghost of a smile, "And let the record show that I love my grandson Leo, who is the only one of them who came to sit with me instead of to sit on my estate. I have watched that video more times than I can count. I will watch it for the rest of my life." On Monday, Arthur filed his petition for emergency guardianship, complete with Dr. Ellis's assessment that Alistair was non-compos mentis. And on Monday afternoon, Whitfield, my Whitfield now, loyal and terrified and useful, filed the response. A nationally recognized neurologist's competing assessment, a time-stamped video of the testator lucidly refuting the exact claim, an appointed note observing that Dr. Ellis was a longtime golf partner of the petitioner and had never once treated the patient for any cognitive condition in the record. The judge threw the petition out before lunch on Tuesday and referred Dr. Ellis to the medical board for the conflict. And Arthur walked out of that courthouse having achieved nothing except to put his own name on a failed fraud in the public record, which I reflected, screenshotting the chat's meltdown, was one more log on the fire my grandfather had built. Because the chat, the chat. The judge threw it out, Gavin typed, and I could feel the spittle through the screen. There was a video. Where did a video come from? Where did that neurologist come from? Who is paying for this? Leo doesn't have that kind of money. He works at a nothing firm. So who is funding him? Who is the leak? And Arthur, colder, more frightened, typing the sentence that told me he was finally, dimly, beginning to sense the shape of the thing that was eating him without ever being able to see it. Someone is one step ahead of us on everything. Every move we make they've already countered. It's like they can see what we're planning before we do it. I want everyone's phones checked. I want to know who in this family is talking to Leo. I looked at that. I want to know who in this family is talking to Leo. And I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because Arthur had finally asked the right question. Who is one step ahead of us on everything? And he was going to spend the rest of this war torturing the wrong answer out of the wrong people. Hunting a traitor in his ranks. Checking phones. Accusing his sister. Isolating his allies. When the truth was simply that he'd forgotten to click one button on the night his father got sick. And the man he was trying to erase had been reading his mail ever since. They never checked for me. Not once. That's the part one need you to sit with because it's the whole cold heart of it. Even now, even losing, even sensing an impossible enemy who saw their every move, not one of them ever thought to open the member list of their own chat and scroll to the bottom. Because scrolling to the bottom would have meant considering that the Vance boy was worth scrolling for. Their contempt was total, and their contempt was my armor, and I wore it all the way to the end. But being one step ahead in a chat doesn't protect you from a knife in a room, and Arthur, cornered and humiliated and desperate, finally did the thing desperate powerful men do when the clean plans fail. He went dirty, and he went public. There was a family gathering that Sunday, a vigil they called it. The whole extended clan and a good slice of the company's board summoned to the Thorne estate to be near Alistair in his final days, which really meant to position themselves, to be seen, to start the succession theater early. And Arthur used it. He stood in that great room, glass in hand, the very picture of the grieving, responsible eldest son, and in front of 40 relatives and 8 board members, he performed a masterpiece of quiet character assassination aimed at me. "I have to say something," he said, voice heavy with false reluctance, "because I love this family too much to stay silent. Some of you have noticed that Leo, Clara's boy, has been spending a great deal of time alone with my father these past weeks, controlling his visitors, bringing in his own doctors, his own lawyers, filing his own documents." He let the pause do its work. "I don't want to believe the worst, but I would be failing all of you if I didn't say plainly that I am deeply concerned that a vulnerable dying man is being isolated and manipulated by someone with a great deal to gain and a lifelong grudge against this family. I'm not accusing, I'm grieving, but I'm asking all of you to watch, to protect Father, and to ask yourselves why the one person who was cut off from this family for a generation is suddenly so very devoted now that there's an estate at stake." 40 faces turned to look at me. I felt the temperature of the room change, felt the whispers start, felt 19 years of being the stain crystallize into this single moment where Arthur tried to weaponize my whole history against me. The outsider, the wrong name, the sudden devotion, the classic profile of a manipulator. And I understood that this was the real cost. This was the price of my grandfather's patience. That to keep the trap intact, I had to stand there and take it, say nothing, defend nothing, let the room believe the worst. Because the second I revealed what I knew, the second I showed the chat or the will or the plan, the trap sprang early and the forfeiture clause lost its evidence, and the whole 3-year fortress came down. So I took it. I stood in that great room and let my uncle paint me as a predator in front of the family and the board. And I said quietly, "I love my grandfather. I saw what they planned. I can't do this anymore, Leo. I don't think you're manipulating him. I think you might be the only honest person left in this family. Meet me tomorrow, alone. There's something about Arthur you need to know, something even the chat doesn't." I met Mina the next morning in a coffee shop far from anywhere a thorn would be caught. And before I let myself trust a word she said, I did the thing the chat had taught me to do. I checked. Because Sarah was still inside, still trusted, and the night before, after Mina's private message, I'd had Sarah gently probe the group. "Is everyone still solid? I worry about leaks." And I'd watched Arthur type back in the chat, where he thought only allies could see, "Mina's gone soft. Watch her. If she wobbles, we cut her out, too. She's got no real standing, anyway. She married in. No real standing." Arthur had just done to his own sister exactly what he'd done to me. Dismissed her, diminished her, put her on the erase list the moment she showed a conscience. And that told me Mina's defection was real, because a woman doesn't get thrown off the raft and then run back to it. So I trusted her. And she gave me gold. "Arthur isn't just after the inheritance," Mina said, hands wrapped around a coffee she wasn't drinking. "The inheritance is the backup plan, Leo. For the last 2 years, Arthur has been quietly moving company money, real money, operating capital, into a set of vehicles he controls. I only found out because I sit on the foundation board, and the numbers stopped reconciling, and no one would explain the transfers. He's been bleeding the company on the assumption that when Alistair dies, he'll be running it, and any hole he's dug will be his hole to fill or hide. But if the will doesn't go his way, if he doesn't end up in control, those transfers become embezzlement. Provable embezzlement. He's not fighting for the estate because he's greedy, Leo. He's fighting for it because if he loses it, he goes to prison." I set down my cup very slowly, because this changed the entire shape of the war. It explained the desperation, the guardianship gambit, the public character assassination, the willingness to burn his own sister. Arthur wasn't a man reaching for more. He was a man who had already stolen and who needed control of the company to bury theft, and for whom losing meant not disappointment but handcuffs. A greedy man you can outmaneuver. A cornered criminal you have to actually cage because he has nothing left to lose and will do anything, and anything is a wide and ugly country. "Can you prove the transfers?" I asked. "I can point to them. Proving their theft and not legitimate. That takes access I don't have. But you?" She looked at me, and there was something almost like hope in her tired face. The chat. You've been reading the chat, haven't you? That's how you're always ahead. I figured it out watching Arthur lose his mind about the leak. It's you. You never left. Oh, Leo. And she laughed, a small broken laugh. They spent this whole month plotting in a room with you standing in the corner, didn't they? They forgot I was a person, I said. It's a habit of theirs. Mina became my second window into the family. Not a spy inside the chat like Sarah, but something more valuable now. A legitimate board member with legitimate access and a genuine grievance willing to pull the financial records that would turn Arthur's whispered embezzlement into documented prosecutable fact. And I needed her fast because Arthur, sensing the will was slipping away from him, stopped waiting for his father to die and made his most aggressive move yet. The one Mina's intelligence let me see coming from a different direction than the chat. Because Arthur had gotten careful enough, finally, to keep his worst plans out of the group. He called an emergency board meeting. The pretext was noble. With the founder gravely ill and questions swirling about undue influence at his bedside, my character assassination recycled. The company needed stable interim leadership to reassure the markets and protect shareholder value. The reality was a coup. Arthur would have himself named acting chairman while Alistair was incapacitated in practice, if not in law, seize operational control of the company regardless of what anyone said, and use that control to bury his embezzlement and starve me out of any inheritance that turned out to matter. He'd stopped trying to win the will and started trying to make the will irrelevant by simply taking the thing it governed. The board meeting was in 4 days, and this time the chat couldn't save me because Arthur wasn't plotting the coup in the chat. He'd learned that much. But it didn't matter because Arthur had made his fourth and largest mistake long ago, and it was finally time to spend it. He had spent 19 years being certain he knew exactly what the Vance boy was, and he was about to walk into a boardroom and find out he'd been wrong about the one thing that mattered most. Because here is what no one in that family knew, the secret my grandfather and I had kept for 7 years, the reason the old man had smiled when he told me he was leaving me everything. The stake Alistair had given me off the books at 22, the one I'd grown quietly in the dark. I hadn't just grown it in my own ventures. I'd grown it in Thorn's stock patiently, invisibly, through the same blinds and vehicles that hid the rest of my fortune, on my grandfather's quiet advice, for 7 years, buying the company's shares whenever the family's carelessness let them slip loose, accumulating in silence while they all assumed the Vance boy couldn't afford a nice watch. Until the charity case they were about to erase from the will had become, without a single one of them noticing, one of the largest individual shareholders in Thorn Group. Not enough to control it, but more than enough to walk into an emergency board meeting that had been called to erase me, and B, to Arthur's absolute horror, entitled to a seat at the table, a voice in the vote, and the legal standing to demand a full, independent audit of exactly the transfers Mina had told me about. For days, Arthur thought he was calling a meeting to seize a leaderless company. He was actually calling a meeting that would, for the first time in 19 years, force the entire Thorn family and board to look directly at the person they'd spent a generation refusing to see, and to discover all at once that he owned a piece of the very empire they'd told him he'd never be part of. I was still savoring it that night, planning the boardroom, when Sarah's hand closed on my arm, and I looked up and she was holding her phone, and her face had gone pale, and she turned the screen to me. It was the chat. A single new message from Arthur, time-stamped 1 minute ago, and it said, "Everyone to the hospital. Now, the doctors just called. It's happening. Father doesn't have the night. My grandfather was dying tonight, and the will, the trap, the 3 years of patience, all of it was about to come due, ready or not. They performed grief at his deathbed and plotted through it in the chat, and I have the timestamps to prove it. And I think that single fact tells you everything about the people I'm related to. We gathered in the ICU that night, the whole clan, and in the room, out loud, there were tears and held hands and murmured, 'I love yous.' Arthur gripping his father's hand telling him what a great man he was. And on my phone, silenced in my pocket, buzzing against my leg while my grandfather's breathing slowed, the same people typed. Beatrice, dabbing her eyes in the corner, thumb moving under her shawl. How long do these things usually take? I have the Aspen house booked. Gavin, head bowed as if in prayer. Reading should be within the week. Everyone remember the plan. Leo comforts himself with Vance Street. We control everything else. Do not let grief make anyone sentimental about the boy. And Arthur, actually weeping, actually holding his dying father's hand, his other hand hidden typing. The moment he's gone, I filed to freeze the estate accounts so Leo can't touch anything. Whitfield's neutralized, but I have another lawyer ready. This ends the way it was always going to end. He gets nothing. He gets nothing. Typed by a man holding his father's hand as the man died. I stood on the other side of that bed and I read it, and I did not scream, and I did not throw my phone across the ICU, and I did not stand up and tell 40 grieving, performing relatives what their tears were made of, because my grandfather had taught me the last and hardest lesson of all, that the deepest revenge is not loud. It waits. It gathers. It lets the enemy write one more line. So, I said nothing, and I took one more screenshot. Arthur's, he gets nothing. Time-stamped 11:52 p.m. His father minutes from death. And I put it in the folder, and then I put the phone away, because the folder could wait, and the man in the bed could not. I got my moment. Near the end, when the others had drifted to the waiting room to make calls and check flights, and I have no doubt to plan, the nurse gave me a few minutes alone, and I sat where I'd sat every clear morning for a month, and I took my grandfather's hand, the same hand Arthur had been performing over, and Alistair opened his eyes one last time and found me. And he was lucid. One final window. The shark surfacing one last time before the deep. Leo, he breathed. Are they there in the waiting room? I said. Planning. He almost laughed. It came out as a rattle. Of course they are. Even now. His fingers tightened on mine. You have everything you need? The chat, the video, the neurologist, Mina's records, the will. I leaned close so he could hear me. I have all of it. It's done. You built it perfectly. You don't have to hold on for the trap, grandfather. The trap is finished. It's been finished for weeks. They just keep walking further into it. Something eased in his face then. Some last vigilance he'd been carrying for 3 years finally allowed to set down. Then listen to me, he said, because this the part that isn't in any will. His voice was almost gone. The company, the money, the seat at the table, that was never the inheritance, Leo. That's just the weight. The inheritance is that I saw you. When no one else in this family would look at Clara's boy, I looked, and I saw the only one of them worth a damn. And I spent 19 years making sure that one day everyone else would have to look, too. That's what I'm leaving you. Not the empire. The end of being invisible. His eyes held mine. When you stand up in that room and they finally see you, don't do it for revenge. Revenge is small. It's Arthur's currency, not ours. Do it because your mother deserved to be seen and they erased her. And you are the proof that they failed. Be seen, Leo, for her. That's the whole inheritance. The rest is just money. I couldn't speak. I held his hand, I nodded, and he saw me nod. And the corner of his mouth moved one last time, and he said, so quietly I felt it more than heard it, good boy. My good boy. Tell them Clara's son said hello. And then the window closed gently. And the dark went down into the deep, and the machines began their long, flat song, and Alistair Thorne was gone. I sat with him until the nurses came. The family flooded back in for the performance of the end, the wailing, the collapsing, Beatrice's theatrical sob, Arthur's manly grief, and I watched all of it from the corner where I'd always stood. The stain, the Vance boy, invisible even now at the deathbed of the only man who'd ever seen me. And my phone buzzed one final time that night, and it was Arthur, who had wept over the body not 10 minutes before, and it said to the chat, to his co-conspirators, over his father's cooling hand, it's done. He's gone. Reading is Thursday, 10 a.m., Whitfield's office. Everyone be there. Everyone hold the line. And remember, whatever sentimental garbage that old man might have said to Leo at the end, it doesn't matter. The documents are what matter, and the documents are ours. Thursday, we finish this. Thursday, the Vance boy finally learns his place. I read it standing over my grandfather's body. Thursday, the Vance boy finally learns his place. And I put the phone in my pocket, and I looked down at the man who had raised me and trained me and trapped my whole family in a fortress of their own worst natures. And I made him a promise, the last one, the one that mattered. Thursday, I told him silently. Thursday, they learn his place, and it isn't the one they think. I walked out past my weeping, scheming family, and I drove home to Sarah, and I did not sleep, and I did not cry until I was in her arms in the dark, and then I did, for a long time, for my grandfather and my mother in 19 years of the corner. And when I was done, I got up, and I opened the folder, and I began to build the presentation for Thursday, message by message, screenshot by screenshot, timestamp by timestamp, 40 of them now, an avalanche waiting for a single word to let it fall. They had 4 days left of thinking they'd won. I intended to let them enjoy every hour of it. Thursday came gray and cold, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Thorne family gathered in the largest conference room of Whitfield's firm to divide a dead man's empire. And they arrived the way conquerors arrive, relaxed and expansive, already spinning in their heads. I watched them file in from my seat at the far end of the long table, the seat farthest from the head, the stained seat, the one I'd been assigned by a lifetime of habit, with Sarah on one side of me and Mina, pale and resolute, on the other. Arthur took the head of the table without being offered it, because in his mind it was already his. Gavin lounged. Beatrice had, I swear to God, brought a notepad. And every one of them passing me gave me some version of the look, the pitying, dismissive, almost kind look you give a man at the reading of a will you already know cuts him out. The look that says, "Poor Vance boy, brace yourself." Arthur even patted my shoulder. "Chin up, Leo," he murmured, warm as a snake in sun. "Whatever happens today, you're still family, sort of." And under the warmth I could feel the gloat, the anticipation, the same appetite I'd been reading in the chat for a month, and I said, "Thank you, Uncle Arthur. That means a lot," and I meant none of it. And I let him have his moment, because my grandfather had taught me that you let a man climb all the way to the top of the ladder before you point out he brought it to the wrong wall. Whitfield was there, sweating, and the family assumed he was running the reading, and the first crack in their confidence came when Whitfield cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, I should note that I am not the custodian of the operative instrument. I'll defer to counsel who holds it." And a door opened, and a woman none of them had ever seen walked in. She was in her 50s, sharp-suited, unhurried, carrying a single sealed folder, and she introduced herself as Ms. Nlovo of a firm 3 states away, and she said, in a voice like a closing vault, "I represented Alistair Thorne in the preparation and safekeeping of his last will and testament, executed 31 months ago, superseding and revoking all prior instruments. He engaged me specifically because I have no relationship of any kind with this family or this company, and he instructed me to appear today and read his true wishes into the record in the presence of you all." The room's temperature dropped 10 degrees. Arthur sat up. "Superseding what?" "Whitfield holds Father's will. We've reviewed Father's will." "You reviewed a will Mr. Thorne allowed you to believe was current," Ms. Lovu said without a flicker. "He was quite specific on that point." "May I proceed?" "He was also quite specific that I not be interrupted." She sat. She opened the sealed folder, and I watched my family begin for the first time to be afraid because a stranger holding a secret will is the one thing a conspiracy built on a known will cannot survive. And they could feel the ground moving and could not yet see how far it would fall. Ms. Lovu read the preamble of sound mind, freely and without coercion, revoking all prior wills. And then she reached the dispositive clauses, and the room stopped breathing. "To my daughter Clara's son Leo Vance," she read, "who alone among my descendants asked not what I had built, but how, and who alone came to my side to sit with me rather than to sit upon my estate, I leave the following." A pause. "My controlling interest in Thorne Group in its entirety. My personal holdings, real and financial in their entirety. My seat as chairman to be his to assume or delegate as he sees fit. The residence at Thorne Estate and the whole of the remainder of my estate not otherwise specified." She turned the page in total silence. "In short, everything." The room detonated. Beatrice's notepad hit the floor. Gavin shot to his feet shouting. Beatrice was talking over Mina, who was talking over Ethan, and Arthur went white, then red, then a shade of purple I'd never seen on a human face, and he slammed his palm on the table and roared, "This a fraud. This exactly what I warned you all about." He isolated a dying, senile old man and manipulated him into this as the product of undue influence and diminished capacity, and I will challenge it in every court in this state until Leo Vance is bankrupt from legal fees. Do you hear me? This ends in litigation. This ends with nothing for the manipulator. Mr. Thorne, Ms. Ndlovu did not raise her voice, and somehow that stopped him. Your father anticipated that reaction, nearly word for word, in fact. He instructed me to enter into the record, alongside this will, a comprehensive contemporaneous capacity assessment from an independent neurologist of national standing. A time-stamped video recording of the testator lucidly affirming these exact provisions, and specifically predicting that you would allege incompetence and undue influence, and the sworn documentation of a licensed attorney, Mr. Whitfield, regarding a separate attempt to have the testator declared incompetent that a court has already reviewed and dismissed as meritless, with a referral of the petitioning physician to the medical board. She looked up. Your father did not leave a will, Mr. Thorne. He left a fortress. I would advise you, as I advise anyone, to consider very carefully whether you wish to spend your inheritance attacking it. Your inheritance. That was the tiny seam in her calm, and Arthur was too far gone in his fury to catch it, but I caught it because I knew what was coming, because there was one more clause. Ms. Ndlovu let the room roil for a moment. Let Arthur sputter about lawyers. Let Gavin demand a copy. Let Beatrice ask, appallingly, whether everything included the Aspen house. And then she said, there is a final provision. Mr. Thorne was extremely specific about its placement. He instructed that it be read last, after the dispositive clauses, in the presence of the entire family, and only then. He said, and I'm quoting from his instructions to me, by the time you read the last clause, they will have shown everyone in that room exactly who they are. Let them. Then read it. She looked around the table at the greed and the fury and the fear, and something almost like grim amusement touched her mouth. He seemed very confident you would oblige him. Having watched the last 10 minutes, I begin to understand why. She turned to the final page. And I stood up. I stood up from the stained seat at the far end of the table, and every head turned and Arthur snarled, "Sit down, Leo. The adults are," and I said quietly, in a voice that carried in a way the Vance boy's voice had never once been allowed to carry in that family, "No, I don't think I will. Not this time." And I set my phone on the table, screen up, the inheritance folder open, 40 screenshots deep. And I looked at my Uncle Arthur for a long moment, and I said, before Ms. Ndlovu reads the last clause, there's something the whole family should see. Something you all wrote. Something you forgot I could read. The room went utterly silent, and Arthur's purple fury drained all at once to the gray of a man who had just felt the floor he was standing on turn out to be a trapdoor. And he whispered, "What did you say?" I said, I repeated evenly, that you forgot I could read it. The chat, Uncle Arthur. Thorne estate planning. The one you created 22 minutes after grandfather was admitted to the ICU. You added everyone from the old family group, holidays, his care schedule, 19 years of logistics. And in your hurry to plan my erasure, you added me, too. And then you all spent a month plotting in a room you'd forgotten I was standing in. I picked up my phone. I never left. I turned off my read receipts on the first night, and I have read every single word every one of you has typed for the last 31 days. The silence in that conference room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. I watched it hit them one at a time, watched Beatrice's hand fly to her mouth, watched Gavin's face slacken as he mentally scrolled back through everything he'd typed, watched Ethan go rigid, watched the exact moment each of them remembered a specific message and understood that I had it. And Arthur lunged for the tablet in front of him as if he could delete a month of history, as if the chat lived anywhere now but in a folder backed up to 3 clouds and printed, I should mention, in a bound copy that Ms. Ndlovu's associate was at that moment distributing around the table. You'll want to follow along, I said. I made copies. I didn't shout. That's the part I'm proudest of looking back. I didn't rage. I didn't gloat. I didn't become Arthur. I just read. I read them their own words in order with the timestamps into the silence. And the timestamps did what no accusation of mine ever could, because the timestamps could not be spun. November 3rd, 11:47 p.m. Grandfather had been in the ICU for 22 minutes. Uncle Arthur. The Vance boy gets nothing, and I mean nothing. I turned the page. Aunt Beatrice, same night. Daddy's little charity case. Do we know how much he's expecting? I looked up at her. She was crying now, but I did not stop. Gavin to my wife in a private message he then bragged about to the group. Enough that you never have to worry whatever happens with Leo. You offered my wife money to manage me like a symptom. I turned to Sarah, and Sarah, who had sat silent and demure through the whole reading, the picture of the frightened recruited wife, finally let the mask fall, and she smiled at Gavin, a bright, cold, patient 8th grade teacher smile, and said, I forwarded every word of it to Leo the same night, Gavin. I was never your inside woman. I was his. Gavin made a sound like a man stepping off a stair that wasn't there. I kept reading. The guardianship plot. If a court declares him mentally incompetent, the will doesn't matter. Dr. Ellis, the golf partner, the fraud a judge had already thrown out. And then, because my grandfather had taught me that the deepest cut is the true one delivered quietly, I read the last one, the one-eyed screenshotted standing over his cooling body. 11:52 p.m. the night he died. Grandfather had been gone for less than 10 minutes. Uncle Arthur, holding his father's hand. I was in the room. I watched you type this with your free hand. Wrote to this chat. It's done. He's gone. Whatever sentimental garbage that old man might have said to Leo at the end, it doesn't matter. Thursday, the Vance boy finally learns his place. I set the phone down. Well, I said into the ringing silence, it's Thursday. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The words were their own, and words in your own hand with a timestamp cannot be argued with, only survived. And they were not going to survive these. And into that silence, Ms. Nglovu, who had watched the entire thing with the serene attention of a woman witnessing the exact event her client had predicted to the hour, turned to the final page of the will and said, and now, as instructed, the last clause. She read it slowly, so that every word landed. It is my expectation that upon my death, certain members of my family will attempt to defraud, coerce, or otherwise manipulate the disposition of this estate to disinherit my grandson Leo Vance. I have built my life on the principle that a person's true character is revealed by what they do when they believe no one is watching. Therefore, I direct the following. Any beneficiary, heir, or family member who is shown to have participated in any scheme, plot, or coordinated effort to fraudulently alter this estate, to have my capacity falsely challenged, to coerce any party, or to otherwise subvert my clearly stated wishes, shall by that act forfeit, immediately and permanently, any bequest, claim, interest, or standing in my estate whatsoever. Their share to pass in its entirety to Leo Vance. Character is destiny. Let theirs be their inheritance. Ms. Ndlovu lowered the page. The documentary evidence of exactly such a coordinated scheme, she said mildly, appears to have just been read into the record by Mr. Vance in the presence of all parties, in the family's own words, with timestamps. I'll be entering the full chat log as an exhibit. In my professional opinion, every individual who participated in that group has, by the plain language of this clause, forfeited any claim to this estate. I'll leave the litigation to the litigators, but I would note that it is difficult to challenge a will on the grounds of undue influence when one has, in writing, spent a month documenting one's own. The room broke, not into shouting this time, into ruin. Beatrice was sobbing. Gavin sat with his head in his hands. Ethan had gone very still and very small. And Arthur turned on me with the last wild fury of a cornered man and snarled. You think this over? You think a chat and a clause? I'll tie this up in court for 10 years. All the company still needs leadership. I still control you control nothing, uncle. And now, finally, I let a little of it show. Not rage, but the cold weight of everything I'd been holding for a month, for 19 years. Because there's one more thing you forgot, the same way you forgot me. You forgot to wonder how the Vance boy afforded a national neurologist and a firm 3 states away. You assumed I was poor because you needed me to be. I'm not. I let that land. For 7 years, on grandfather's advice, I've been quietly buying Thorn stock through vehicles none of you ever noticed because none of you were ever looking at me. I am one of the largest individual shareholders in this company, which means I already had the standing before this will, before today, to demand a full independent forensic audit of every transfer you've made from company accounts over the past 2 years. Arthur stopped breathing. Aunt Mina brought me the discrepancies weeks ago. I went on quietly. The vehicles you've been bleeding operating capital into. The holes you were planning to bury under the control you were so sure you'd inherit. That audit starts Monday, and we both know what it's going to find, don't we? That the reason you fought this dirty, the reason you'd burn your own sister and forge your father's decline, and type, he gets nothing over his dying hand, was never greed. It was fear. Because if you didn't end up controlling this company, theft you've already committed becomes exactly what it is. You weren't fighting for an inheritance, Arthur. You were fighting to stay out of prison, and you lost. I sat back down. I didn't need to stand anymore. Arthur Thorne looked around that conference room at his sobbing sister, his broken son, his forfeited fortune, his coming audit, his own words bound and distributed on the table in front of him, and he did not rage again. Because there was nothing left to rage at, only the slow, total comprehension of a man who had climbed a ladder all the way to the top and finally looked down to see it had been leaning the whole time against the wrong wall. Grandfather wanted me to tell you all something. I said into the wreckage, and I kept my voice gentle because my grandfather had asked me to do this for my mother, not for revenge, and I meant to honor that. At the very end, lucid, holding my hand while you were all in the waiting room planning to freeze his accounts, the last thing he asked me to do was to say hello to you. From my mother. From Clara. The daughter you erased, whose son you spent a month trying to erase all over again. I stood, and I gathered my phone and my folder in my wife's hand, and at the door I turned back one last time to the family that had never once in 19 years bothered to see me. And I let them see me now. Clara's son says hello, I said, and I walked out. The litigation Arthur promised never came because there is no lawyer alive who will attack a will on grounds of undue influence for a client who spent a month documenting his own conspiracy to commit exactly that. 3 separate firms took Arthur's money for a consultation, and 3 separate firms handed it back after reading the chat log, because the chat log wasn't evidence you argue against. It was a confession you survive, and Arthur's whole family had signed it 40 times over with timestamps. The forfeiture clause held like iron. Every person in that chat lost every claim to the estate, their shares flowing exactly as my grandfather had written it, to me, so that by the simple arithmetic of their own greed, the family that had gathered to ensure the Vance boy got nothing had instead handed the Vance boy everything, including the shares they'd been fighting over. A result so perfectly, symmetrically just that I think Alistair must have laughed about it in whatever room he's in now. And the audit came Monday as promised, and it was worse than even Mina had guessed. Arthur hadn't bled the company by millions. He'd bled it by tens of millions over 2 years into a web of vehicles he'd been certain he'd control before anyone looked, and now everyone was looking. Forensic accountants, and before long, prosecutors. Because embezzlement at that scale isn't a family matter, it's a crime. And the same documentation that had made my grandfather's fortune such a fortress made Arthur's theft impossible to hide. He was charged within the month. He spent the fortune he had left on defense lawyers instead of golf, and the last I heard of my Uncle Arthur, the man who'd typed the Vance boy gets nothing over his father's dying hand. He was facing a trial he would not win. Ruined, disgraced, abandoned by the co-conspirators who blamed him for the chat that sank them all. He'd wanted to control an empire, so his crimes would stay buried. Instead, he'd led his whole family into a clause that stripped them bare, and an audit that would put him in a cell. And he'd done it, from first message to last, in a chat he forgot I was in. I did not gloat. I want that on the record because it would have been so easy, And because a younger, angrier version of me, the one who'd spent 19 years in the corner, wanted to badly. But my grandfather's last lucid words were in my ears. Revenge is small. It's Arthur's currency, not ours. Be seen for your mother, not for revenge. So I didn't crush them for the pleasure of it. I just let their own words do exactly what they were always going to do, and I turned my attention to the harder thing, the thing that actually took character instead of just patience. Deciding what kind of man held all this power now that it was finally, undeniably mine. Because here is the part the story doesn't usually tell you. When the forfeiture clause stripped the family, it stripped all of them, including Mina. She'd been in the chat, too, added like everyone else, present for the plotting. By the plain language of the clause, she forfeited alongside the rest, and she knew it. And she came to me the week after the reading not to ask for anything, but to say goodbye. Because she assumed, having watched what I could do, that the Vance boy she'd helped was about to become another thorn, and she'd made her peace with getting nothing. I was in the chat, Leo, she said simply. I don't expect mercy. I just wanted you to know I'm glad it was you. Alistair chose right. And I looked at my Aunt Mina, the one who'd typed, "Let's be humane about it" on the first night, the one who'd wobbled, defected, brought me the audit that would put Arthur away, who'd been thrown off the raft by her own brother for the crime of having a conscience. And I understood that this, right here, was the real inheritance, the one that wasn't money. Because I now held total discretionary power over the fortune the family had forfeited, I could keep every cent. It would be just. They'd earned their ruin. Or I could do the thing Arthur would never have done in 1,000 years, the thing that separated my grandfather from his vultures, and, I hoped, me from all of them. Grandfather's clause forfeited your legal share, I said. It doesn't say anything about what I choose to do with what's mine now. And what's mine now includes the discretion to see people clearly, which is the one thing this family never learned how to do. I slid a folder across the table to her. I'd had Ms. Nlovu prepare it. You brought me the truth when it cost you everything, and you expected nothing back. You're going to run the Thorn Foundation, really run it, with real money. The charitable arm grandfather always meant to build, and Arthur always meant to loot. And there's a personal trust in there, too, in your name, because you showed conscience when conscience was expensive. And in my grandfather's world, in mine, that's the only currency that actually holds its value. Mina cried then, the way people cry when they've braced for a blow and been handed grace instead. And I let her. And I understood that I'd just done the one thing that made all of it worth it. Not the money, not the win, but the choice to see a person the way my grandfather had seen me. And to reward the rare good thing instead of punishing the whole flawed person for the ways they'd failed. That's what he'd left me. Not the empire. The eyes to see who was worth saving, and the power at last to save them. As for the rest, Beatrice, Gavin, Ethan, the ones who'd plotted without a flicker of the conscience Mina had shown, I did nothing cruel, and I did nothing kind. I simply let the will stand, let them keep exactly what their own words had earned them, which was nothing, and let them go build whatever lives they could out of the ruins of the ones they'd tried to build on my erasure. Gavin, who'd offered my wife money, ended up selling the $40,000 watch. I didn't arrange it. I didn't have to. Character is destiny. My grandfather had that carved into the will, and it turned out to be less a threat than a weather forecast. I let the weather come. And on a gray morning, 3 weeks after the reading, I put on a suit, a good one finally, no longer a costume, and I walked into the Thorn Group headquarters, past a lobby full of employees who'd spent their whole careers never knowing my name. And I took the elevator to the top floor, and I walked into the chairman's office that had been my grandfather's, that a month ago Arthur had been so certain would be his. And I stood at the window looking out over a company that 1,000 families depended on, a living thing built over a lifetime by the one man who'd ever seen me, now placed against every expectation of every person who'd ever called me the stain the hands of Clara Vance's forgotten son. And my phone buzzed in my pocket. The buzz, that first one, was Sarah. Are you standing at the window in your grandfather's office being dramatic and staring meaningfully over the city? Her message read. And then before I could answer, you are, aren't you? Come home when you're done being a titan. I made dinner. In the small apartment. We're keeping the small apartment, Leo. I don't care how many houses you inherited. That kitchen is where you cried in my arms, and it stays ours. I laughed out loud alone in the chairman's office, and I felt the tight, cold thing I'd been carrying for a month loosen at last, because that was the whole of it, wasn't it? That after all the will and the war and the chat, the one true thing was still a woman keeping a small apartment because it was where we'd been real. We kept the apartment. We keep it still. I texted her back, on my way. And then I did the thing I had actually come to that office to do. The thing that mattered more than the shares or the seat. The thing my grandfather had told me was the real inheritance. I called a meeting, not of the family. There was barely a family left, but of the company. The whole company. Every employee Thorn Group had in the atrium and on the video links. 1,000 people who had spent their careers building a thing my grandfather made and who had never once heard the name of the man who now held it. And I stood up in front of all of them. The stain, the Vance boy, the charity case. And I introduced myself finally out loud to a room that was going to have to learn to see me. My name is Leo Vance, I said. Most of you have never heard of me, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is the whole story of this company's future. So, I'm going to tell you the truth because my grandfather built this place on the principle that people show you who they are when they think no one's watching. And I'd rather you all watch me tell the truth than catch me hiding it. And I told them, not the ugly details, not the chat, not the audit. That was for lawyers and would come out in its own time. But the true thing. 30 years ago, this company's founder had a daughter named Clarence. She fell in love with a school teacher instead of a fortune, and the family erased her for it. She was my mother. She died when I was 11, and the only person in the Thorn family who refused to pretend she'd never existed was Alistair himself, who took in her son, me, and taught me everything he knew quietly for 19 years while the rest of the family treated me as a stain to be hidden. He left this company to me, not because I'm blood, though I am, because I'm the only one who ever asked him how he built it instead of waiting to spend it. The atrium was silent, 1,000 people leaning in. So here's what you can expect from me. The founder's real values, not the version his heirs were going to strip for parts. And one change, effective today, I'd cleared it with Miss Ndlova that morning. It was the first order I gave as chairman and the only one that ever made me cry giving it. The Thorn Foundation is being fully funded and relaunched, and it's going to be called the Clara Vance Foundation, and it's going to spend real money putting scholarship kids like my father, kids the world writes off, through school. Because a family spent 30 years pretending my mother's name was a shame, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it a thing that opens doors. I don't know what I expected, polite applause maybe. What I got was 1,000 people rising to their feet, and it wasn't for the chairman, I understood. It was for the story because every one of them had been overlooked by someone somewhere, forgotten in some corner. And they were standing for the idea that the forgotten one could walk out of the corner and turn out to be the whole point. My grandfather was right. The inheritance was never the empire. It was the end of being invisible and standing in that atrium, seen at last by 1,000 people and by my mother wherever she was, and by the old man who'd spent his life building me this exact moment. I finally understood what he'd given me, and it had nothing to do with money, and it was worth more than all of it. I went home to the small apartment. Sarah had in fact made dinner. We ate it at the little second-hand table that had scandalized the family in the 3 rooms we were keeping forever, and for one whole evening there was no chat, no will, no war, just my wife and the quiet, and the strange new weightlessness of a man who has finally set down a burden he'd carried since he was 11 years old. It should have been the end. In every version of this story I'd imagined during the long, cold month of the chat, it was the end. The will read, the family fallen, the mother honored, the good wife and the small apartment, and the credits rolling on a man who'd finally been seen. But it wasn't the end. Because late that night while Sarah slept, my phone buzzed one more time on the nightstand. I picked it up half asleep, expecting nothing, and the screen showed a notification that stopped my heart the way the very first one had a month before on a cold hospital floor. You were added to a group chat. I stared at it, and every instinct the last month had burned into me came awake at once because I knew that notification now. I knew exactly what it felt like to be added to a room where people planned to erase you. But this one was different, and the difference was what made the hair stand up on my arms, because this chat had no other members listed and no name, and when I opened it, there was a single message waiting from an unknown number, and it did not read like the careless cruelty of a family that had forgotten me. It read like something far more dangerous, like someone who knew exactly what I'd done to Arthur and exactly how, and had chosen their words to prove it. "Congratulations on the inheritance, Mr. Vance," the message said. That was a beautiful piece of work, letting them type their way into their own forfeiture. I've studied it. Genuinely elegant. But I think you should know something. Now that you're sitting in Alistair's chair, holding a company a great many powerful people have wanted for a very long time. Your grandfather had enemies who were patient enough to wait 30 years for him to die. They were counting on Arthur, weak, greedy, controllable Arthur to inherit, because Arthur could be managed. You were not in anyone's plan. You've upset a board much larger than your family's, Mr. Vance, and unlike your relatives, the people you've inconvenienced will not be so careless as to add you to their chat by mistake. I'm adding you to this one on purpose. Consider it a courtesy. The family was the small game. You just wanted a seat at the large one. And up here, everyone already knows you can read a room. Sleep well, Chairman. We'll be in touch. I read it 3 times in the dark, my heart pounding, Sarah asleep beside me, the small apartment quiet around us. The family had forgotten I was in the chat. But whoever this was hadn't forgotten anything. They'd added me deliberately, knowing I'd read every word, because the trick that had saved me against careless enemies would be worthless against enemies who knew I could see. My name is Leo Vance. I spent a month reading a chat my family forgot I was in, and it made me the head of an empire. And I'd just been handed a new one by someone who wanted me to read it, which meant, for the first time, I had absolutely no idea what it actually said. I didn't answer the message that night. My grandfather taught me that the man who replies fast is the man who's afraid. And I had learned the hard way, over a long, cold month, exactly how much advantage lives in the space between a message received and a message answered. So I let it sit. I showed it to Sarah in the morning over coffee in the small apartment, and I watched her read it twice with the same still focus she'd brought to the very first chat. And she said the thing that reframed the whole board for me, the way she always did. "They made a mistake," she said. "Same as your family, just a smarter version of it." "They didn't make a mistake, Sarah. They added me on purpose. That's the whole threat. They know I read chats, so the trick that beat Arthur is dead. They're careful. They're patient. They waited 30 years. "Right," she said. "But ask yourself why a careful, patient enemy who could simply move against you in silence instead chose to announce themselves. Why send the message at all? Your family added you by accident, and it destroyed them. These people added you on purpose, which means they want something from the contact itself. You don't reach out to a man you're just going to crush. You reach out to a man you want to study, or recruit, or frighten into a mistake. They didn't add you to erase you, Leo. They added you because you're an unknown quantity sitting on something they want, and they need to know what you are before they decide how to take it. That message wasn't a threat. It was a job interview, and that means you're not the prey yet. You're still a player they haven't figured out." I looked at my wife across the secondhand table, and not for the first time I thanked whatever luck had made a scholarship kid's forgotten son marry an 8th grade teacher who could read a power play like a hall pass, and I understood she was right. The message was an appraisal, which meant I had exactly one advantage left, and it wasn't the chat this time. It was that they didn't know what I was yet. And as long as they didn't know, I got to decide what they saw. So, I spent a week learning who they were before I answered a word, and I every quiet resource the Vance boy wasn't supposed to have. I put the unknown number through people who trace unknown numbers for a living. It died in a thicket of relays, professional, exactly as I'd expected. But my grandfather's real gift to me had never been the chat, it was the files. Alistair Thorne kept files on everyone, a lifetime of them, in a safe only I could open. And I went into that safe now not for a lawyer's cut corner, but for the thing the message had told me existed. Enemies patient enough to wait 30 years. And in my grandfather's files, in his own careful hand, I found them. He'd known. Of course he'd known. There was a folder decades thick labeled only the Standing Committee, and it documented what the message had hinted at. A loose, patient consortium of old money families and quiet capital. The kind of people who don't appear on any board, but decide which boards matter. Who had for 2 generations absorbed independent companies into their orbit, one patient acquisition at a time. And who had, my grandfather's notes made brutally clear, marked Thorn Group for absorption years ago, and been waiting only for the founder to die. And there, in Alistair's handwriting, underlined twice, was the sentence that turned my stomach to ice. They have been cultivating Arthur since he was 30. He doesn't know he's theirs. When I'm gone, they intend to have him inherit, indebt him, and fold the company into the committee through a man they own. The only defense I have is to make sure Arthur never inherits. Leo is the defense. Leo must never know until he has to. If he knows too soon, he'll fight them before he's strong enough, the way I fought them at his age and nearly lost everything. I sat in front of that safe for a long time, because it meant the whole war with my family, the chat, the will, the trap, had never been the real war at all. It had been my grandfather's opening move in a much older game. He hadn't just been protecting me from Arthur's greed. He'd been keeping his empire out of the hands of the people who'd been trying to take it for 30 years. And he'd done it by making sure it passed to the one heir they hadn't cultivated, hadn't planned for, couldn't control. The stain, the Vance boy, the unknown quantity. My whole life, the corner I'd stood in, the invisibility I'd resented, it had also been the thing that made me the one weapon the committee never saw coming. Arthur was theirs. I was Alistair's. And the game the old man had been playing for 30 years had just, with his death, been handed to me. So, on the 7th day, I answered the message. I thought carefully about what to write because these were not careless people, and every word would be studied. And I decided on the one strategy that fit a man who just learned he was a piece his grandfather had spent 30 years positioning. I would let them keep thinking I was small. It had worked for 19 years. It had worked on Arthur for a month. Let it work here at the large table one more time. I typed, "Thank you for the courtesy. I'll be honest, I didn't ask for any of this. I'm a school teacher's son who got handed a company by a grandfather with a flair for the dramatic, and I'm frankly out of my depth. I'm sure people like you have plans that are bigger than anything I understand. I'd rather not be in anyone's way. Tell me what you want, and let's see if there's an arrangement that lets a small man keep his head down." I read it back. It was perfect. It was the Vance boy, humble and overwhelmed and eager to be managed. Exactly the read they wanted. Exactly the man they could fold. And it was a lie in every syllable. And I sent it. And I felt my grandfather's 30-year game settle onto my shoulders. And I understood that I had just done the most dangerous thing of my life. I had invited the people who'd been trying to eat this empire since before I was born to underestimate me on purpose, the way everyone always had. The 3 dots appeared under my message. Someone, somewhere in a room I couldn't see, was typing. And I watched that pulsing ellipsis the way I'd watched the very first one on a cold hospital floor a lifetime ago. And I thought, here we go again. Except this time they know I'm reading. This time small is a choice, not an accident. And this time the person on the other end of the chat is smart enough to know that, too. The dots resolved. And the reply that came back turned everything I thought I understood about the game upside down, because it said, "Nicely done, Mr. Vance, but we both know the humble act is a costume. Alistair taught you better than that, and I should know because 30 years ago he learned it from me. Did the old man never tell you? Before I was his enemy, I was his partner. I'm the one who taught your grandfather everything he knew, and I've been waiting a very long time to meet the boy he built to take my company back. His name was Sterling Croft, and by the time I finished reading my grandfather's files on him, I understood that I had spent a month fighting the junior varsity. 40 years ago, Alistair Thorne and Sterling Croft had built the original company together. 2 young men, one leased freighter, a handshake, and for a decade they'd been partners and something close to brothers. And then, my grandfather's notes recorded in his own spare hand. Without self-pity, they had come to a fork. A chance to grow fast by doing something quietly ruinous to a lot of people who'd trusted them, or to grow slow and stay clean. Croft wanted the fast road. Alistair wouldn't take it. They split the company down the middle, and Alistair took his half and built it slow and clean into Thorn Group, and Sterling Croft took his half and built it fast and dirty into something that had no name on any door, the Standing Committee, a web of capital and influence that had spent 30 years swallowing the kind of clean, patient, family-held companies that Alistair represented, absorbing them one by one, because to Croft, every independent company Alistair admired was a living rebuke to the road Croft had chosen. And the last and largest rebuke, the one he wanted most, was Thorn Group itself. He doesn't want the company for the money, my grandfather had written. He has more money than God. He wants it because as long as it stands, clean and free in mind, it's proof he chose wrong. And Sterling has never in his life been able to live with proof that he chose wrong. He'll wait until I'm dead. He'll take it through whoever inherits. And he'll tell himself it was just business, right up until he owns the last thing I built. And even then, it won't fix what he actually can't stand, which is that I slept well for 40 years and he never has. I read that, and I understood my enemy better from my dead grandfather's notes than Croft probably understood himself. And that was the first weapon Alistair left me for the large game. Not the chat, but the truth about the man across the table. Croft made his first move within the week, and it was patient and elegant, and exactly what a 30-year predator does. And I only caught it because my grandfather's files told me where to look. It didn't come as a hostile takeover. Croft was far too good for anything so loud. It came as a resignation. My chief operating officer, a steady, respected 20-year veteran of the company named Paul Mendez, abruptly announced his retirement, and on his way out, recommended his replacement, a brilliant, charming external candidate with an impeccable resume named Gavin Sinclair, who just happened to be available, who interviewed like a dream, who had the unanimous enthusiasm of a board still rattled by the Arthur scandal and eager for stability. Gavin Sinclair was Croft's. I knew it before I could prove it because I knew the shape of it now. The patient insertion of an owned man into the machinery of a company you intend to swallow. A hand on the controls that looks like good governance right up until the day it isn't. But knowing and proving are different animals, and here was the cruelty of my new situation. Against Arthur, I'd had the chat, the confession delivered daily to my phone. Against Croft, there was no chat. Croft knew I could read. Croft would never be careless. Sinclair would never type a plan I could screenshot. The trick that had made me was worthless here, and Croft had designed his whole approach around that fact, and I could feel him watching through Sinclair to see whether the humble schoolteacher's son would even notice the knife sliding in. So I did the only thing left to a man whose best weapon has been taken away. I stopped relying on it, and I remembered that my grandfather had never actually taught me to read chats. The chat was luck. What he'd taught me for 19 years was to read people and balance sheets, and the small tales that a man leaves when he's serving two masters. And Gavin Sinclair, brilliant and careful as he was still a man serving two masters, and two mastermen leave awake the same as Arthur's embezzlement had left awake the same as every hidden thing leaves a dent in the visible world if you know how to look. I didn't confront him. I watched him. I gave him rope, real responsibility, real access. Exactly what he'd been inserted to obtain, and I watched what he did with it, and where the information went, and which routine decisions he steered a half-degree off true, and I documented all of it quietly in a new folder the way my grandfather had taught me, because I was learning that the chat had never been the point. The discipline was the point. The patient gathering of proof while your enemy thinks you're asleep. And I brought in help Croft wouldn't expect, because the large game needed more than one player, and I was done fighting alone. Mina, now running the Clara Vance Foundation and sitting on the main board, became my eyes in the boardroom. Whitfield, still terrified and still useful, watched the legal machinery for the fingerprints of committee lawyers. And Sarah, who had eaten my family alive from inside their own chat, turned her quiet, bottomless hall monitor patience on the problem of Gavin Sinclair's too perfect life. And it was Sarah who found the thread, because Sarah had learned from the first war that the way you catch a careful liar is never through the lie itself, but through the small, honest details he forgets to fake. His references are perfect, she told me one night, laptop glowing in the small apartment. Too perfect. Every previous employer sings the same song, in almost the same words. But I looked at where he worked before, the actual companies, and Leo, 3 of the 4 don't exist anymore. They were independent, family-held firms, and within 2 years of Gavin Sinclair joining each one as a trusted senior executive, every single one of them was quietly absorbed into a larger entity and broken up. He's not a COO. He's a demolition charge with a resume. He's done this before, over and over, and the pattern is always the same. He joins, he's beloved, he stabilizes, and then the company he stabilized disappears into the same shape every time. She turned the screen to me, and there it was, the wake, the dent in the world that even the most careful man can't help but leave. For companies, 3 now gone, 1 about to be, and behind all of them, when you trace the absorbing entities back far enough through the shells, the same patient shadow. The Standing Committee. Sterling Croft. My grandfather's oldest enemy had put his best demolition man inside my company with the unanimous blessing of my own board. And the only reason I could see it at all was that a dead man's files had told me the shape to look for, and a schoolteacher had refused to be impressed by a perfect resume. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since the second chat had appeared on my nightstand, I smiled because I finally understood how to fight a man who knew I could read. You don't beat a reader-aware enemy by reading him. You beat him by remembering that he's so busy making sure you can't read his words that he forgets you can still read his wake, and that a demolition charge, however charming, is only useful to the man who lit it for as long as the building doesn't know it's there. I didn't fire Gavin Sinclair. Firing him would have taught Croft exactly one thing, that I could see, and I had already decided that the most valuable secret I owned in the large game was the same secret that had won the small one. Let the enemy keep believing you're blind, and use the channel they built to reach you as a channel to reach them. Arthur had built me a chat, and I'd read it. Croft had built me a mole, and I was going to make him my mailbox. So I kept Sinclair close. I gave him more, not less, brought him into my confidence, asked his advice, let the beloved demolition man believe he'd stabilized the anxious young chairman and won his trust, exactly the role Croft had inserted him to play. And then slowly, carefully, I began to feed him. Not lies exactly. Lies are brittle, and a careful man tests them. I fed him truths bent a few degrees, real information shaded to build a false picture, the way Sarah had fed my family enough real-sounding detail to keep their trust while keeping them slow. I let Sinclair discover that I was overextended and frightened. I let him find evidence that I was quietly exploring a sale of the logistics division to raise cash, that I doubted my own board, that the schoolteacher's son was in over his head and looking for an exit. All of it false. All of it precisely the story Croft already wanted to believe, and all of it flowing back through Sinclair to the committee like water down a pipe I'd turned to my own purpose. And it worked because Croft, for all his patience, wanted the humble school teacher read to be true, the same way Arthur had wanted the crying charity case read to be true. And men will believe almost anything that flatters the plan they've already made. I know it worked because Croft told me in the chat, in the ongoing conversation between us that had become the strangest relationship of my life. A nightly game of correspondence chess between a dead man's heir and a dead man's oldest enemy. I hear you're thinking of selling the logistics division. Croft wrote one night. Sensible. It's the crown jewel Alistair bled for those port contracts. But a man who's in over his head is wise to lighten the boat. If you're serious, the committee could make that very easy for you. A clean price, quietly, no proxy fight, no public mess. You keep a comfortable stake, you step back from a game you never asked to play, and everyone sleeps well. Including at last me. I read that. Everyone sleeps well. Including at last me. And I remembered my grandfather's note. He's never slept a night in 40 years. And I understood that Croft had just, without meaning to, show me the shape of the only victory he actually wanted, which had nothing to do with logistics or ports or money. He wanted absolution. He wanted the last clean thing Alistair built to fall into his hands, so that the choice he'd made 40 years ago would stop being a rebuke. And a man who wants absolution more than he wants a company is a man who can be beaten because he's not actually playing to win. He's playing to stop feeling something. And that makes him predictable in a way a pure predator never is. So, I played the fish. I let Croft believe I was reeling toward the sale. I let the negotiation begin through lawyers, through Sinclair, a slow, careful courtship toward the moment I'd hand him the crown jewel. And every day I let it advance. I was doing 3 other things underneath it that Croft couldn't see because he was so pleased to be reading me at last that he'd stopped watching my wake the way I was watching his. First, I was quietly buying. The same way I'd accumulated Thorn stock in the dark for 7 years, I now moved as the Vance boy nobody thought had money through the same invisible vehicles to lock up every loose share of the company I could reach, tightening my own control of the thing Croft thought I was too frightened to hold, so that when the proxy fight came, and it would come, I'd already owned the ground. Second, through Mina on the board and Whitfield in the legal machinery, I was documenting Sinclair. Every bent decision, every leaked file, every fingerprint of the committee's demolition pattern, building the same kind of folder that had ended Arthur. A case that would, at the right moment, let me not just fire a mole, but expose a 30-year predator's method to every regulator and every other family-held company Croft had ever circled. And third, the one that mattered most, the one my grandfather would have loved. I was learning Croft. Every night in the chat, while he thought he was studying the frightened boy was studying him. His tells, his hungers, the exact places where 40 years of not sleeping had worn the patience thin. And I was building, message by message, the one thing you need to beat a man who's too careful to be trapped by his own words. A complete map of what he wants so badly that he'll walk into a trap he can see just to get it. Sarah watched me work night after night in the small apartment, and one evening she said, "You're not the same as you were with your family. With Arthur, you were just surviving. With this, you're enjoying it." She wasn't wrong, and it worried me, and I said so. My grandfather warned me about that. I told her. Revenge is small, he said. It's Arthur's currency, not ours. And Croft? Croft is what happens to a man who's brilliant and lets the game become the whole point until winning it is the only thing he has left, and he can't even remember what he wanted to win it for. I don't want to become that. I don't want to beat Sterling Croft so badly that I turn into him. Sarah took my hand across the second-hand table. Then here's how you don't, she said. You remember why you're doing it. Arthur, you beat for your mother, so Clara's name would open doors instead of being a shame. Fine. So, who do you beat Croft for? Find that and hold on to it. And you can play the game as well as he does without becoming him, because he's playing to stop hating himself, and you'll be playing for someone real. I thought about it a long time that night after she'd gone to sleep, and I found my answer in my grandfather's files, in the list of the companies Croft had swallowed over 30 years, the family firms, the founders like Alistair who'd chosen the slow, clean road and been eaten for it, the thousand small, good things absorbed and broken up so that one man who couldn't sleep could keep proving to himself that the clean road was for suckers. I wasn't going to beat Croft for the money or the company or even for my grandfather. I was going to beat him for all of them, every founder he'd ever eaten for the crime of choosing to build something clean, and for every future one he'd eat if the last and largest rebuke, Thorn Group, finally fell. That was the why. That was the thing that would let me play his game without becoming him. And the next morning, I sent Croft a message telling him I was ready to move forward with the sale of the logistics division and to set a date for the two of us to meet in person at last to shake hands on it. Because I decided it was time to stop playing correspondence chess with the man who taught my grandfather everything, and to look Sterling Croft in the eye, and to let him get one good long look at the frightened schoolteacher's son he was so sure he'd finally figured out. Sterling Croft chose the meeting place, a private dining room at the top of a building I later learned he owned through 4 blinds. And when I walked in, he was already there, alone. No lawyers, an old man by the window with the city spread out below him. And my first thought, before he even turned around, was that my grandfather had been exactly right, because you could see the not sleeping on him. Croft was Alistair's age, but where my grandfather had worn his years like a well-built house, Croft wore his like a debt. He was immaculate and sharp and radiated the particular restless brilliance of a man who has never once in 40 years been able to sit still inside his own head. He turned and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled. And it was a genuine smile, warm even. The smile of a man meeting someone he's been curious about for a very long time. "So," he said, "Clara's boy. The one Alistair hid in plain sight. Sit. Sit. I ordered for both of us. I hope you don't mind. At my age, you stop pretending menus are decisions." I sat. And for the first hour, Sterling Croft was the most charming man I have ever met. And I understood immediately why 3 generations of family firms had welcomed his demolition men with open arms. Because charm like that isn't a tool, it's a climate. You just find yourself wanting to agree. He told me stories about my grandfather, young Alistair, the lease freighter, the handshake, the decade when they were brothers. And the stories were funny and warm and clearly true. And by the end of the first hour, I had to keep reminding myself that this delightful old man had spent 30 years eating everything my grandfather loved. And then, over coffee, Croft set down his cup and got to it. Because men like Croft always get to it eventually, and the getting to it is the only honest thing they do. "I'm going to tell you something about your grandfather," he said, "and you're not going to want to believe it. And then you're going to check, because you're a checker, I can tell. And you'll find out it's true, and it's going to change how you see this whole story. So, brace yourself, son." He leaned in. Alistair was not a clean man. The story he told you, the fork in the road, the fast, dirty way and the slow, clean way, him choosing clean and me choosing dirty, it's a beautiful story, and it's a lie. Or at least it's the lie he needed to sleep on. The truth is that the thing that split us 40 years ago, the ruinous thing, the thing that hurt a lot of people who trusted us, Alistair did it, not me. He made the dirty move that built the foundation of everything you now own, and then he couldn't live with it. And he needed someone to be the villain of the story, so he could be the hero of it, and he picked me. And he spent 40 years polishing his halo by pointing at my horns. Everything you inherited, everything you think is clean, is built on one buried ruinous thing your sainted grandfather did and blamed on me. I have the proof. I've had it for 40 years. And I'm offering it to you, not as a threat, as a gift. Because I think you deserve to know what you're actually the heir to before you decide to go to war for it. I want to tell you I didn't feel anything. I'd feel better about myself if I could tell you that. But the truth is that it landed like a blow, because it was aimed with 40 years of precision at the exact seam in me. The boy who'd been given nothing but the memory of a grandfather who saw him offered a reason to doubt the one clean thing in his life. And Croft watched it land pressed. "You're already like me, Leo," he said gently. "You know that, don't you? Look at what you did to your own family. You sat silent in that chat for a month, gathering, letting them hang themselves, and then you destroyed them at a funeral. That's not the schoolteacher's son. That's the slow, clean road. No, that's my road. Alistair's road, really. The one he pretended he never took. You have the gift, the real family gift, the one Clara's soft husband could never have given you. You can see people, and you can wait, and you can strike. Stop pretending you're a small man who got lucky. Come sit at the large table where you belong. Sell me the logistics division as a gesture of good faith. Take your seat on the committee and inherit what your grandfather actually was instead of the fairy tale he sold you. The clean road is a story rich men tell to feel better. There's only one road, son, and you're already on it. And I'm offering to stop being your enemy and start being the mentor Alistair pretended to be while he was busy making you his weapon. It was a masterpiece. I want to be honest about that. It was the single most sophisticated attack anyone had ever aimed at me because it didn't threaten what I had. It poisoned what I'd loved, and it dressed the poison as respect, and it offered me a version of myself that was seductive precisely because it contained a grain of truth. I had sat silent in that chat. I had struck at the funeral. There was a coldness in me that Croft had named correctly, and I sat there across from him, and I felt the whole thing pull at me. And then I thought about Sarah at the second-hand table asking, "Who do you beat Croft for?" And I found my footing, and I understood exactly what Sterling Croft was because he just shown me. He was a man who could not bear for anyone to have chosen the clean road, because if the clean road was real, then his 40 sleepless years were his own fault. So, he had to make everyone dirty. He'd made Alistair dirty in his own mind to survive the split, and now he was trying to make me dirty to survive the sight of me, Clara's son, holding the clean thing, a living rebuke exactly the way my grandfather had been. He wasn't offering me a truth. He was recruiting me into his excuse. "You might even be right about my grandfather," I said quietly, and I watched a flicker of triumph cross Croft's face, and then I took it away from him. Maybe he did something ruinous once, 40 years ago. Maybe the foundation isn't clean. I'll check because you're right. I'm a checker. But here's the thing you got wrong, Mr. Croft, the thing you've had 40 years to figure out and never could. It doesn't matter whether the road starts clean. It matters which way you're walking on it now. My grandfather might have done one dark thing and spent 40 years walking away from it, building clean, funding hospitals with no name on them, raising the grandson everyone else threw away. And you did one dark thing and spent 40 years walking deeper into it, eating every clean thing you could find to prove the clean thing was a lie. Same starting point, maybe opposite directions. And you can dress it up as there's only one road all you want. But the reason you can't sleep and he slept fine isn't that he was a hypocrite. It's that he turned around and you never did. Croft's charming warmth went very still. "So no," I said, and I stood up. "I won't sell you the logistics division, and I won't take a seat at your table, and I won't inherit your excuse. I'll check what you told me about my grandfather, and if it's true, I'll do what he did. I'll turn around and walk the other way and spend my life making it right in my mother's name. That's the inheritance, not clean hands. The direction you walk after you've dirted them." I buttoned my jacket. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Croft, and for the tell. You just spent an hour showing me the one thing you want more than my company, which is for me to be as unable to sleep as you are. I'm going to enjoy sleeping fine for the rest of my life. It's going to drive you insane." I was almost to the door when Croft spoke again, and the charm was gone now. And what was underneath it was the 30-year predator, cold and patient and unbothered. And he said the thing that turned my victory to ash in my mouth. "Sit back down, Leo. We're not finished. You think this was a negotiation you could walk out of?" He smiled, and it was a different smile now. "I already own the logistics division. I've held a controlling interest in the port contracts through 3 shells for 2 years. Arthur sold them to me quietly to fund the holes in his accounts, and neither he nor your grandfather ever knew who the buyer really was. The crown jewel of Thorn Group has belonged to me since before Alistair died. I didn't bring you here to buy it. I brought you here to tell you I already have my hand around your company's throat, and to give you the chance to be smart about it. A chance you've just very nobly thrown away." He gestured at my empty chair. "Now, sit down, Chairman, and let's talk about what it's actually going to cost you to keep the rest." I sat back down, not because he told me to, because sitting back down was the move, and my grandfather taught me that you always take the move even when it looks like surrender, especially when it looks like surrender. Croft relaxed a fraction, reading it as the frightened boy folding. And that fraction of relaxation was worth more to me than the whole crown jewel, because it told me he still believed the reed he'd been fed, and a man operating on a false reed is a man you can walk off a cliff. "You've had the port contracts for 2 years, I said slowly, as if absorbing a blow. "Arthur sold them to you to fund his embezzlement. Quietly, through shells. Neither he nor Alistair ever knew the buyer." Croft spread his hands, magnanimous in victory. "So, you see the position, Leo. I hold the choke point. The logistics division routes through contracts I control. I can strangle Thorn Group's core operations anytime I choose, and no clever chat, no school teacher's wife is going to change that. Which is why you're going to be reasonable now. A seat on the committee, a graceful folding of Thorn into something larger. And in exchange, I don't close my hand." He smiled. "Your grandfather would understand. This just business. It's funny you say Arthur sold them to fund his embezzlement," I said, "because that's the exact word my forensic auditors used. Fund his embezzlement." I let it sit for 1 second, and I watched the first hairline crack appear in Sterling Croft's certainty. Because a predator that patient has excellent instincts, and his instincts had just felt the floor move. Here's the thing about buying assets from a man to fund his crimes, Mr. Croft. When those crimes come to light, and they have, Arthur's under criminal indictment, The audit's complete. It's all on the public record now. Every transaction that was part of the fraud becomes vulnerable. Arthur sold company assets he wasn't authorized to sell at prices designed to move money without board approval as part of a documented scheme to embezzle, which makes those sales voidable, Mr. Croft. Ultra vires. Tainted at the root. My lawyers have been building the case to unwind every fraudulent Arthur transaction for 2 months. I just didn't know until this exact moment that the biggest one led to you. That wasn't quite true. I'd suspected for weeks, ever since Alistair's files hinted the port contracts had gone missing. But I let Croft think I'd only just connected it. Because a victory that looks like luck is more disarming than one that looks like a plan. You can't unwind a 2-year-old transaction, Croft said. But the warmth was gone and the certainty was going. The committee's counsel structured it airtight. Nothing is airtight when the seller's in prison for the fraud the sale was part of, I said. You know that. You've spent 40 years buying things cheap from desperate men. You of all people know exactly how it looks when a court starts pulling on a thread that starts with the word embezzlement. You didn't buy the crown jewel, Mr. Croft. You bought stolen goods from a thief, and you did it through shells specifically so no one could trace it to you, which felt very clever 2 years ago and looks very different now that unwinding it means a court examining exactly why a shadow entity paid an embezzling executive for his company's core assets in secret. I leaned in, and now I let him see it. The thing he'd tried so hard to convince me I already was. Not the frightened schoolteacher, and not his cold reflection either, but the third thing, the thing Alistair had actually built. And here's the part you're going to hate, because it's the clean road doing what you spent 40 years insisting it can't. I don't have to destroy you to win this. I just have to file. The moment I move to unwind the Arthur transactions, the port contracts come back into dispute. Your secret ownership becomes a matter of public record, and every regulator already crawling through Arthur's fraud starts asking who the mystery buyer was and why he hid. And once your name is on the record as the shadow that bought a crown jewel from an embezzler, every family-held company you've ever circled, every founder your demolition men are working on right now, gets to learn the pattern. Gavin Sinclair's 4 companies, the absorptions, the whole 30-year method, because I've been documenting that, too. You didn't put a knife to my throat, Mr. Croft. You put your hand around a choke point that's wired to a bomb, and I'm the only one holding the trigger, and the trigger is a court filing. Silence. The city glittered below us, and Sterling Croft looked at me across that table with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life, because it wasn't anger and it wasn't fear. It was recognition. The specific stunned recognition of a man who has spent 40 years being the smartest person in every room and has just met the grandson of the one person who was ever smarter. You planned this, he said slowly. The sale rumor, the desperation, Sinclair, you fed me the reed. You wanted me to overcommit to the port contracts, to bring you here confident, to show you my hand. I wanted you to do exactly what you did, I said. You knew I could read chats, so you were careful with your words. You forgot the older lesson. You forgot to watch your wake. You've been so proud of the fact that I couldn't read your messages that you never noticed I was reading you. I stood again, and this time Croft didn't tell me to sit down. So, here's my offer, and unlike yours, it's real. I'm not going to file, yet. Not because I can't, but because a court battle bleeds everyone, and my grandfather taught me that you only spend blood when there's no cheaper win. You're going to quietly return the port contracts to Thorn Group at the price Arthur stole them for, undoing theft, which conveniently also keeps your name off the public record. You're going to recall Gavin Sinclair and every other demolition charge you've got buried in my company, and you're going to leave Thorn Group alone, permanently, because we both now hold a trigger on each other, and the difference between us, Mr. Croft, the difference that's going to keep you up tonight the way you've been up every night for 40 years, is that I can walk away from mine and sleep fine, and you can't walk away from anything, ever, which is the whole reason you lost this thing. Moment you decided you needed to win it, I walked to the door. This time I didn't look back. Check on my grandfather's foundation sin, by the way, I said. I will. And if it's true, I'll make it right in the open, with my name on it, in the daylight, which is the one move you've never once been able to make, and the reason a school teacher's son just took the crown jewel back from you over coffee. Good night, Mr. Croft. Try to sleep. I left him there, alone, at the top of a building he owned through 4 blinds, an old sleepless predator who'd finally met the clean road he'd spent his life insisting was a myth, wearing a suit, drinking his coffee, holding a company's throat he could no longer squeeze. And I walked out into the night, and I called my wife, and I said, "It's done. This round. He'll be back. They always come back. But the port contracts are coming home, and Sinclair's finished, and Thorne's safe." And Sarah from the small apartment said, "Come home and tell me all of it." And I did. That night, after I'd told Sarah all of it, the coffee at the top of Croft's building, the port contracts, the trigger we now each held on the other, she was quiet for a while, curled against me in the small apartment. And then she said the thing that has stayed with me longer than anything Croft or my grandfather or the will ever said. "Do you remember?" she asked. "The first night? The hospital floor? You showed me the messages, and I told you not to warn them, to let them keep typing, to make small your disguise instead of your wound." "I remember. I keep thinking about the man who sat on that floor," she said. "How scared he was under how calm he looked. How he'd spent his whole life being told he didn't count, and had almost started to believe it. And now that same man is holding a stalemate with the most dangerous person in the country, and building rooms so strangers never have to stand in a corner alone." She propped herself up to look at me in the dark. "I need you to promise me something, Leo. The game's going to try to make you into it. Croft already tried. Come sit at the large table. You're already like me. And you're not right now. You're still the man from the floor. But the table erodes people. That's what it's for. So promise me you'll keep this. The small apartment. The papers I grade at this table. The version of you that's still just my husband when the door closes. Because the day you can't come home to 3 rooms and be nobody special is the day Croft finally won. No matter what the shares say." I promised her. I promise her still every night by coming home. Because she was right. The way she's always right. The whole war, from the forgotten chat to the coalition, had only ever been worth winning because there was a second-hand table to come home to, and a woman grading essays at it who'd loved a man when he had nothing anyone could see, and who was in the end the one person in my entire life I had never once had to read, because Sarah had never spoken a word to me that wasn't true. And a man who has spent his life learning to see through everyone treasures beyond any fortune the single person he never has to see through at all. I turned off the light. Outside the city held all its numbers and all its chats and all its patient predators. And somewhere in it an old man wasn't sleeping. But in 3 small rooms a scholarship kid's forgotten son slept fine next to his wife the way his grandfather had taught him, the way Croft never could. And that, more than the empire, more than the coalition, more than the whole long reckoning, was the inheritance. Sleeping fine, being seen by the one who mattered. Coming home. The port contracts came home within the month, returned at the price Arthur had stolen them for through the same silent shells that had taken them. And to the outside world nothing had happened at all, which was exactly how Sterling Croft needed it, and exactly the price I made him pay for peace. His surrender had to be as invisible as his attack, so that the only 2 people who ever knew the school teacher's son had taken the crown jewel back from the 30-year predator over coffee were the 2 of us. Gavin Sinclair resigned the following week, citing a wonderful new opportunity, beloved to the end. And I let him go with a handshake and a reference that said exactly nothing. And I watched the demolition charge walk out of my company without ever detonating. And I understood that this was what winning actually looked like at the large table. Not a funeral, not a folder read aloud, not a family destroyed in a conference room, but a quiet nothing. A hole where a catastrophe was supposed to be. A company that simply went on standing while the men who'd planned to eat it retreated into the shadows they'd come from. Croft went quiet, not defeated. Men like Croft are never defeated. They only reassess. But quiet, holding his trigger while I held mine. The 2 of us locked in the patient stalemate of enemies who each know exactly how much it would cost to fire. He'll be back. The committee is larger than one sleepless old man, and I have no illusion that the war is over. But Thorne Group was safe, and my mother's foundation was funded. And I had learned the one lesson that separates the men who survive the large table from the men who get eaten at it. That the goal is never to win the game forever, because no one wins forever. The goal is to still be standing and still be clean when the next round begins. And then there was the last thread, the one Croft had left in me on purpose, the poison dressed as a gift, my grandfather's sin. I checked. Of course I checked. Croft had read me right about that. I'm a checker. And a man who won't examine the foundation of the thing he's decided to defend is just a different kind of coward. So I went into Alistair's files, all of them, the deepest and oldest, and I found it. And it was true. Not all of it. Croft had shaded it the way I'd shaded things for Sinclair, bent the truth a few degrees to make it land, but the core of it was true. 40 years ago, at the fork in the road, my grandfather had made the dirty move. He'd done the ruinous thing, the one that hurt people who trusted him, the thing that built the foundation of everything I'd inherited. It was restitution. My grandfather had done one terrible thing and spent the rest of his life and a secret fortune walking it back. One anonymous act of repair at a time, telling no one, taking no credit, because credit would have made it about him instead of about the debt. He'd turned around. He'd spent 40 years walking the other way. Croft was right that the road started dirty. He just could never understand that the direction is the whole thing. And I understood, sitting in front of that safe, why my grandfather had left everything to me and not to any of them. Not just because I asked how he built it, but because I was the only one who would understand what to do with the sin at the bottom of it. Because the vultures would have buried it. Croft would have weaponized it. And I did the thing that finished the whole story. The move Croft had told me to my face that no one on the clean road ever makes. The move that was the entire difference between my grandfather and his oldest enemy. I made it right in the open. I took my grandfather's 40 years of secret restitution, and I brought it into the daylight with my name on it, and my mother's name on it. I established publicly, through the Vance Foundation, a full accounting and a fund for the descendants of the people harmed by that original dirty move. Not anonymously, not in the dark, but openly with an acknowledgement that the thorn fortune had a stain at its root, and that the family's answer, across 2 generations now, was not to hide it, but to repair it in the light forever. My board thought I was insane. You do not, they told me, publicly confess your own company's founding sin. It's a lawsuit magnet. It's reputational suicide. It's mad. And I told them what my grandfather had taught me and what Sterling Croft had accidentally confirmed over coffee at the top of a building he owned through 4 blinds, that the clean road was never about having clean hands. It was about what you do in the daylight after you've dirted them. Croft spent 40 years unable to sleep because he did one dark thing and walked deeper into the dark to prove the dark was all there was. My grandfather slept fine because he did the same dark thing and turned around and spent his life in secret repair. And I was going to sleep even better than he did because I was going to do the repair in the open where it couldn't be a secret weakness anyone could ever poison me with again, where the worst thing about my family's history became, by the simple act of facing it in daylight, the best thing about my stewardship of it. The story broke. It didn't destroy us. It did the opposite, the thing the board couldn't imagine and Croft could never do. It made Thorn Group the one great fortune in the country that had looked its own original sin in the eye and chosen publicly to repair it. Founders started calling, new ones, the family-held ones, the exact kind Croft's demolition men were circling, asking not to be absorbed but to be advised, to learn how the schoolteacher's son had turned a buried shame into daylight strength. And I realized that my grandfather had left me something even larger than a company. He'd left me a way to be the opposite of J.D. Vance at scale, to become, for every clean founder Vance had ever hunted, the thing that proved the clean road was real. And I went home every night to a small apartment with a second-hand table and Sarah and the quiet. Because the one thing I never let the large table take from me was the 3 rooms where a scholarship kid's forgotten son had learned that he was worth loving before anyone knew he was worth anything. In the months right after, the family that had gathered to erase me finished coming apart, and I watched it happen with less satisfaction than you might think, because my grandfather had been right that revenge is small, And there is nothing smaller than watching people you're related to reap exactly what they sowed. Arthur was convicted. It took the better part of a year, but the law thought it was airtight and his own chat was an exhibit, and the man who'd typed "the Vance boy gets nothing over his dying father's hand" went away for the embezzlement he'd committed to fund a control he never got. And I did not go to the sentencing, because there was nothing there for me. Beatrice sold the house she'd never actually owned. It had been in her husband's name, exactly as the family's whole comfort had been in Alistair's, a lesson about borrowed status that she learned far too late, and moved somewhere smaller and stopped speaking to everyone, which for Beatrice was a kind of death. Gavin, my golden cousin, the heir apparent who'd worn a $40,000 watch to his grandfather's ICU and offered my wife money to manage me, discovered that a resume built entirely on being the anointed thorn was worth nothing once he was neither anointed nor a thorn with money, and I heard, through Mina, that he'd taken a job at a firm where no one knew his name and hated every minute of being ordinary. I felt nothing about any of it. Character is destiny. My grandfather had carved that into the will, and I'd learned to treat it less as a curse I'd cast than as a weather I'd simply stopped standing in the way of. But there was one of them I did think about, and his name was Ethan. My cousin Ethan had been in the chat, present, complicit, forfeited with arrest, but he was the one who'd gone quiet as it got ugly. The one whose silence in those last weeks had made Arthur nervous, and I'd noticed it at the time, the way I noticed everything now. Filed it away the way my grandfather taught me to file the small tells that reveal who a person might be under the person they're performing. So when Ethan reached out, months after the reading, a short, ashamed message, no ask in it, just, "I'm sorry, Leo. I should have said something, and I didn't. I was a coward, and I understand if you never want to hear from me again." I didn't ignore it, and I didn't forgive it, either, because cheap forgiveness is just contempt wearing a nicer coat. I did what Alistair had done with me. I tested him. I met Ethan for coffee, and I watched him the whole time. And what I saw was a young man genuinely sick with himself, not performing remorse for advantage. His shares were already gone. There was no advantage left to perform for, but actually, uselessly, sincerely ashamed, which is the rarest thing a person from my family had ever shown me. I went along with it, he said, staring at his cup. I didn't start it. I didn't love it, but I went along because Arthur was strong and you were nothing, and going along was easy. And I told myself it wasn't really my plan, so it wasn't really my fault. And then I watched you stand up at that reading and read us our own words. And I realized the whole time there'd been a person in that chat with more spine than all of us. And it was the one we'd all agreed didn't count. He looked up. "I don't want anything, Leo. I just needed you to know I know what I am now. That's all." And I looked at my cousin Ethan, and I remembered being 17 at a family dinner, humiliated over a fork, and a grandfather who'd seen something in the family stain worth teaching. And I understood that the actual inheritance, the real one, the one that had nothing to do with money, was this exact moment. The power to look at an overlooked, complicit, genuinely sorry young man and decide whether to see him or erase him. And to know that whichever I chose, I'd be choosing what kind of man held Alistair's chair. "Here's what I know about you, Ethan," I said. "You went along with something ugly because going along was easy, and standing up was expensive. That's not a monster. That's just a coward, and cowardice is the most common thing in the world. And the only thing that makes it interesting is what a person does the morning after they finally see it in the mirror." I slid a card across the table. Not a fortune, not a trust like Mina's, nothing he could coast on. Just a name, a mid-level job at a Thorn subsidiary, real work, no favors, everything to prove. You start at the bottom. You earn everything. Nobody there will know you're a Thorn, and you won't tell them. And in 5 years, if you're the kind of man who turned around, you'll have built something real that's actually yours. And if you're still the kind of man who goes along, you'll wash out, and I'll never hear from you again. And either way, it'll be your doing and not mine. That's the same deal my grandfather gave me, more or less. It's the only one worth giving. Ethan stared at the card like it might vanish. "Why?" he said. "After what I did. Why would you?" "Because someone did it for me," I said. "When I was the one everyone had agreed didn't count. And because my grandfather taught me that the whole game, The only game that matters is seeing the person other people have decided not to look at. You were in the chat, Ethan, but you're also the only one who was ashamed of being in it. I'm choosing to see that instead of the rest. Don't make me wrong. He took the card. I don't know yet how it ends. It's only been a little while, and a man's character reveals itself slowly. But the last I heard, he was showing up early and staying late, and had told no one his last name. And I choose to find that hopeful, because a story where absolutely no one turns around is Croft's story, and I refuse to live in Croft's story. That was the thing I understood in those quiet months, driving home each night to the small apartment, that the whole war, the chat, the will, the family, and the larger game still to come had never really been about money or empires, or even about being seen. It had been about a single question my grandfather had spent his life answering, and had left to me to keep answering. When you finally have the power that was used to erase you, do you use it to erase or to see? Arthur, given power, would have erased. Croft, given power, spent 40 years erasing clean founders one at a time. My family, given the smallest scrap of power over the smallest person, had built a chat to erase me. And I, handed more power than any of them, over all of them, had rewarded the aunt who found her conscience, tested the cousin who found his shame, faced my own founding sin daylight, and built a coalition so that no clean founder would ever be erased alone again. Not because I was a saint. I'm not. There's a coldness in me Croft named correctly, a patience that can wait a month while people hang themselves, and I'll carry that my whole life. But my grandfather taught me that the coldness isn't the problem. The direction is everything. You can have the whole hard toolkit of the people who erase, the patience, the reading, the willingness to strike, and point it the other way, at seeing instead of erasing. And that exact turn is the entire difference between a Alistair and a Croft, between the man who sleeps and the man who can't. I visited my grandfather's grave that spring, and my mother's beside it. I'd had Clara moved there, home at last, the disowned daughter restored to the family plot she'd been exiled from. Her headstone reading simply Clara Vance, beloved, seen. I sat with them both for a long time. I told Alistair the company was safe, that Croft was held to a stalemate, that the coalition was growing, that Ethan was showing up early. I told my mother that her name opened doors now, that there were scholarship kids who'd never heard of the Harringtons walking into schools on the strength of the name her family had tried to make a shame. And I told them both the only thing that mattered, the thing that was the whole of the inheritance and none of the money. That Clara's boy had been seen, finally, and had spent everything it bought him learning to see other people in return. A year passed. I want to tell you it was quiet, but the truth is that the large table is never quiet. It only changes tempo, and I spent that year learning its rhythms the way I'd once spent a month learning a family group chat. Sterling Croft and I held our stalemate. Two triggers, two men who could sleep or not sleep, a cold peace made of mutual ruin. And I used the peace not to rest, but to do the thing my grandfather had never quite dared, the thing that turned his 40-year defense into something new. I went on offense, not against Croft directly. That war would come in its own time, on ground of my choosing. Against the thing Croft was at scale. Because I had spent a year discovering that the committee's whole power came from a single fact. The clean founders it preyed on were alone. Each one stood by itself, patient and principled and isolated. And isolation is how you get eaten, one family firm at a time, one beloved demolition man at a time, one quiet absorption at a time. Each founder certain they were the only one, never knowing there were dozens of others being hollowed out by the same shadow, the same way. It was, I realized, the exact loneliness the committee ran on. The same loneliness my family had used to erase me. The same isolation that let them plot in a room they thought I wasn't in. And I knew the cure for that particular disease, because I'd lived it. The cure for being picked off alone is to stop being alone. So I built them a room. Quietly over that year, using Alistair's files and the Claire Vance Foundation, and the strange new authority of the man who'd faced his own foundings in daylight, I began to gather the clean founders. The family-held company's Croft's men were circling, the ones who'd called me asking how I'd done it, into something that had never existed before. A coalition of exactly the people the committee needed kept isolated. Not a corporation, not a fund. Something closer to what my grandfather and Croft had been before the fork. A handshake, scaled up. A way for the clean founders to see each other, warn each other, share the pattern, recognize a demolition man's resume the way Sarah had recognized Sinclair's, and stand together against a predator that had only ever won by keeping its prey apart. I called it privately the thing my grandfather's notes had called Croft's operation, because I liked the symmetry. The standing committee had spent 30 years eating the clean road one founder at a time. I built the clean road a standing committee of its own. And the first time it worked, the first time a family firm 3 states away called a beloved new executive with a demolition man's wake, because someone in the coalition recognized the pattern and made a call, I understood that I had finally done the thing my grandfather built me for. The thing that was bigger than saving one company or honoring one mother. I had turned the loneliness that the canes of the world feed on into its opposite. I had made the clean road a place where no one stood alone. The first founder the coalition saved was a woman named Lena Owusu, and I tell her story because it's the whole thing in miniature. The entire meaning of what my grandfather left me played out in a single week. Lena ran a family shipping parts firm her father had built. Clean and slow and profitable. Exactly the kind of thing Croft's committee loved to swallow. Independent, principled, and alone. She'd never heard of the committee. She'd never heard of me. What she had was a wonderful new chief operating officer hired 6 months earlier, beloved by her board. A brilliant, charming man who'd stabilized her firm beautifully and had impeccable references. And whose name crossed my desk one Tuesday, because a founder in my coalition 2 states away saw the hire announced in a trade journal and felt a prickle of recognition and did the one thing the one coalition existed to make possible. Instead of ignoring it, he made a call. The resume came to me and to Sarah, and it took us one evening at the second-hand table to see the wake. 3 prior firms, 2 now gone, absorbed, broken up. The same shape. Another demolition charge lit and buried, ticking quietly inside a good woman's company while she slept soundly believing she'd made a great hire. And here is the part that would have been impossible a year before. The part that was the entire point. I could warn her. In the old world, Lena Owusu would have been eaten the way every clean founder before her had been eaten. Alone, blindsided, never knowing the pattern until her company was already gone. One more quiet absorption. One more proof to Croft that the clean road was for suckers. But the coalition existed now, the room where the isolated could finally see each other. And so, instead of a demolition, I got to make a phone call to a stranger and say the sentence no one had ever gotten to say to my grandfather or to any of Croft's 100 victims. You are not alone, and I think I can show you something before it's too late. She didn't believe me at first. Of course she didn't. A stranger calls to tell you your beloved co is a saboteur. You assume the stranger's the threat. So I didn't ask her to believe me. I did what I'd learned to do. I showed her the wake, the 3 firms, the pattern, the documentation. And I told her not to fire him. Not yet. Because I'd learned that too from Sinclair. That a demolition man is most useful the moment before he knows he's discovered. I taught Lena Owusu to do to her saboteur exactly what I'd done to Gavin Sinclair. Keep him close. Feed him a bent picture. Watch where it flowed. And gather the proof while he believed he was still winning. And it worked. Because it always works. Because the one constant across my whole strange story, from a family chat to a boardroom, to the largest table in the country, is that the people who erase always underestimate the person they've decided doesn't count. And a demolition man inside a company, he's sure he's smarter than never once thinks to watch his own wake. Within a month, Lena had him cold, documented, provable. And she walked him out of her company with a handshake and a reference that said nothing. Exactly as I had. And her firm went on standing. Clean and free and hers. One more thing Croft had reached for and found, to his growing sleepless fury, already defended. She called me after. I don't understand why you did this. She said, you don't know me. There's nothing in it for you. Firms like mine were used to being on our own. Why would a man running a fortune the size of yours spend a week saving a stranger's shipping parts company? And I gave her the only answer that was true, The one my grandfather had spent 40 years living and I intended to spend my life scaling. Because someone should have done it for the founders who came before you, I said. And no one did because they were all capped alone. And alone is how the clean get eaten. I can't go back and uneat them, but I can make sure it stops being how the story goes. That's all this, Lena. A room where the people who build things clean stop having to stand in the corner by themselves. I spent a long time in that corner. I know exactly what it's worth to find out you were never actually alone in it. She joined the coalition the next week, and she brought 2 founders she knew, and they each knew others, and the room grew. The way a good thing grows once the isolated finally find each other. And somewhere in the shadows, an old sleepless man watched his hunting grounds organize against him for the first time in 30 years. And I like to think it cost him a little more sleep, which at this point was less a victory than a public service. Croft knew, of course. Men like Croft always know. And one night, a year to the day after our coffee, a message arrived in the chat that still connected us, the strange private channel between a dead man's heir and a dead man's enemy. And it said, "You've been busy, Leo, building me a mirror, a coalition of the clean so my founders stop being alone." Clever. Alistair never thought of it. Too proud to admit he needed anyone. It's going to cost me a great deal over the years. A pause, 3 dots, and then I find I'm almost glad. Do you know, I haven't been genuinely challenged in 30 years. Your grandfather was the last one, and then he chose to build slow and clean and leave the game. And I've been eating sheep ever since and calling it a life. And now there's a wolf on the clean road, which should not be possible, and it's Clara's boy. And I confess it's the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a very long time. The dots again. We're going to be at this for the rest of my life, you understand? And then, if you're not careful, for the rest of yours. The large table doesn't release anyone. I tell you to get out while you can, but we both know you won't, because your grandfather didn't build a man who runs. So, instead, I'll just say, welcome to the game, Chairman. Try to sleep. I never could. I read it in the small apartment at the second-hand table, with Sarah across from me grading 8th grade essays, because she never did quit teaching. Not for $50 billion or a coalition of the clean, because the classroom was her 3 rooms, the way the apartment was mine. And I thought about the whole strange road that had brought me here. From a cold hospital floor and a notification I was never meant to see, through a will and a trap and a family that forgot I was a person, to the top of the largest table in the country, and a lifelong game against the man who'd taught my grandfather everything. And I thought about the one thread that ran through all of it. From the very first chat to this last message. The single thread that was the whole secret of my life. That I had spent 29 years being the person no one could see. The stain. The Vance boy. The charity case. The man they forgot to remove from the chat. And that the invisibility they'd meant as an eraser had turned out in the end to be the one advantage no fortune could buy. My family forgot I was in the chat because they couldn't see me. Croft underestimated me because he couldn't see me. And every clean founder the committee had ever eaten had been eaten because they, too, had been made invisible, isolated, overlooked, picked off in a corner where no one was watching. I knew that corner. I'd lived in it my whole life. And I had learned, the hard way on a cold hospital floor, exactly what it's worth to be the person standing in the room that everyone else has forgotten is occupied. My name is Leo Vance. My family built a chat to erase me and forgot I was standing inside it, and it made me the head of an empire and a player at a table that never lets anyone leave. There's an old sleepless predator across the board from me now, and a shadow committee behind him, and a war that will outlast us both. But I have a coalition of the clean and a foundation in my mother's name, and a grandfather's 40 years of files, and a wife grading papers at a second-hand table in 3 rooms will never give up. And I have the one thing none of them will ever take from me. The thing that was underneath the whole story all along. I know exactly what it costs to forget that the quiet person in the corner is still in the room, because I was that person for 29 years, and now I'm the one they can't afford to forget. They should have seen me. That was always their mistake, and it's the last mistake they'll ever get to make for free.